Chapter 376. Those people did not seem to be ordinary merchant caravans. They were soldiers. There were 3 fires, and a dozen or so soldiers sat around each fire. Outside the fires, there were a few scattered soldiers sitting against trees. Further out in the forest, which was difficult for normal people to see, but Li Yunxin could see clearly, there were 2 open sentries and 2 hidden sentries. There were 50 people, and there were no flags or insignias. According to the military system of the Qing kingdom, this should be a unit. Their armor was also very simple. There was a large, curly-bearded man by the fire, wearing chain mail, and a leather helmet on the ground next to him. Looking at his appearance, perhaps he was the captain, the highest commander of this small army. There were 5 other people by his side wearing soft leather armor. None of them had taken off their armor, and they all had helmets. These 5 people should be platoon leaders. In the Qing army, 50 people formed a squad, and 10 people formed a platoon leader. The rest of the soldiers only wore leather armor on their upper bodies, and had green cloth wrapped around their heads. Some held spears, some used knives and shields, and there were 5 archers. This unit had all the essentials. They attacked and retreated. In this era, they could be considered a well-equipped elite army. Li Yunxin swept this information into his mind at a glance. Then, he saw nearly 30 horses in the forest outside the group. But these horses did not all seem to be used for battle. Other than the 5 long-legged horses, the rest were sturdy, short-legged horses. They were not used for battle. They were used to transport goods. The goods were carried in coarse sacks. They had been taken down and piled up in one place. There were also 2 soldiers standing guard. Li Yunxin realized that he must have run into a group transporting red earth to Tongtianze. When he had killed his way into Redstone Gorge, he had seen some monsters wearing armor that was clearly much smaller. Those armors were probably the result of their looting of passing troops. In fact, this point was very thought-provoking. The Yi Kingdom was next to the Li Kingdom and the Qing Kingdom. The Li Kingdom was the largest country in the world, and the Qing Kingdom was not small either. He had heard that the Qing Kingdom's military system was a recruitment system. The soldiers were all professional soldiers, and the number of soldiers was around 100,000. There was no war at the moment. If the emperors of Qing, Yi, and Li Kingdoms truly wanted to help Daotong and Kenzo, and send out a mighty army of hundreds of thousands, and use millions of commoners as backup support, not to mention the mountains, the entire Yi Kingdom would have a sentry every 5 steps, and a sentry every 10 steps. But now, within the borders of these countries and the mountains, there were no armies of human empires to suppress them. Instead, there were many small teams coming and going in the mountains. Perhaps the emperors did not want to contribute to these things? Or could it be said that the celestial sect of wonders was unable to control the dynasty in the secular world? However, these thoughts only spun around in his mind for a moment. Li Yunxin decided to go with them, other than the reason he had thought of before. Since this team was transporting red clay, they had to contact the Daotong Kenzo people. He could actually follow them to take a look at the base level and see the situation of the celestial sect of wonders. The information obtained this way would be much more reliable. Or perhaps, the environment the team was in made him think of a scene from a few months ago that seemed to have happened many years ago. At that time, he was still human. Thus he sat down beside an old tree. Leaning against the tree, he raised his head slightly and closed his eyes as if he was taking a nap. In reality, he was listening to them talk. He activated his magical power. The conversation between the team and the 5 squad leaders was pulled out from the sound of wind, fire, and people. It crossed a long distance and became clear. He listened like this for nearly an hour. During this time, the 6 officers only chatted intermittently. Occasionally, they would rise to order the soldiers to pay attention to their duties and be more vigilant. When they chatted, they talked about unimportant things, such as how someone was sick in a certain fire, how someone's leg was acting up, how someone seemed to be homesick, or how someone had a conflict with someone else today. They were all matters between soldiers, bits and pieces. But these 6 officers seemed to be very familiar with each other. In this era, they could be considered good officers who loved their soldiers, as if they were their own children. Then they talked about their own families. whether their sons would join the army or open a shop in the future, or whether a certain commander had a wife somewhere. Li Yunxin should have been anxious and didn't want to listen. He should have been anxious to listen to something more useful to him, something that could give him a chance to sneak into the team. But for some reason, perhaps Bai Yunxin's words made him hesitate and confused. Slowly, a warm and tired feeling of comfort crept up his body. He suddenly felt that it was actually good to listen to them. Demons, cultivators, fighting, killing, eating people, scheming. He had always been caught up in these things, traveling between the great swamp and the wilderness. His eyes were filled with killings, and his ears were filled with cries of pain. This was his world, the world of demons and cultivators. But there was also another world. In that world, there were very few strong people, and many weaklings lived like reptiles. But the world of these weaklings seemed to be a little more lively than the world of the strong. It was on such a night, listening to their conversation, that lively world that he hadn't seen for a long time slowly unfolded in front of Li Yunxin. So he sighed softly and leaned his body more comfortably against the tree. He knew that he might have to enter the tribulation again, the mortal heart tribulation, or the emptiness tribulation. His supreme indifference tribulation was broken, so he began to have distracting thoughts and desire for love. But it actually didn't feel that bad. After another half an hour, the squad leader, Li Yunxin already knew from their conversation that his name was Ding Min, sighed and said, "We still have to walk for 2 or 3 days before we can go down the mountain. I don't know if our brothers can." He stopped here, as if he didn't want to say anything inauspicious. The 5 squad leaders beside him were also silent. They were all speechless for a while. But after a few breaths, the squad leader still picked up a piece of firewood and threw it into the fire. He couldn't help but say again, "I received a messenger pigeon yesterday. It said that General Shui and Deputy Commander Liu had died in Redstone Gorge." Ding Min said this, and then paused again. "Deputy Commander Liu used to be very kind to me, but now, alas, even if they die, they won't have a good ending." The squad leaders looked at each other and couldn't say anything for a long time. After a while, a man named Su Mao said, "That's not possible, right? General Shui and Deputy Commander Liu brought 2 battalions of people. 2 full battalions of people. Their formation was organized with 5 platoons of 50 people with a platoon leader. 10 platoons made up a brigade of 500 people, with a brigade commander. 2 brigades made up a battalion of 1,000 people, with a commander. 3 battalions made up an army of 3,000 people. Their commander was Marquis Yu, or General Yu." Su Mao said that they brought 2 full battalions of people, which meant that there were 2,000 people. 2,000 professional soldiers, well-equipped and well-trained, could guard a province and a prefecture in the country. Now the army had only set out for 5 days, and they were gone? And they all knew that the reason why there were 2,000 people in a team was because the youngest son of the current general, Li, also wanted to go to Tongtian Swamp. The young marquis had said since he was a child. This time, he heard from the Taoist priest stationed in the capital that the Xianmen mountain was going to fall. So he insisted on going to take a look. Maybe he could even become an apprentice to an immortal. General Li agreed to let him go, and specially assigned an elite troop to escort him there. This troop was not going to transport the red clay, but it was really to protect him. It was said that he had brought a few great painters and a few Taoist priests with him, but now they were all gone. Ding Min shook her head and sneered. It was said that only 100 or 200 scattered soldiers escaped, but it's not optimistic. Although we haven't dealt with them before, we should know what they are, right? They have extraordinary strength, and can even use demonic spells. I heard that the young marquis was impatient to walk on the mountain road like us. He said that he had great painters and Taoist priests with him, so he was not afraid of demons and monsters. He was eager to see them so that he could subdue them. 2,000 people walked carefully in the Redstone Gorge. The young marquis brought hundreds of cavalrymen out of the capital to show his power. But in that kind of place, they all jumped down from the cliffs on both sides and rushed into the army formation. It was immediately chaos. Hundreds of horses trampled many people to death, and they trampled many people to death themselves. Sigh. I can't bear to think about it. The squad leaders were silent in the firelight. After a while, another squad leader asked, "Boss, have you really seen those things?" "Once." Captain Ding Min pondered for a while and said, "When I was young, I just joined the army at the border." Stationed in a castle, the old man said that there was a black wind mountain near the castle, and there was an old demon in the mountain. We didn't believe him, and only thought that the old demon he mentioned was something like a fierce beast. Then one night we saw it with our own eyes. It jumped in from outside the wall. It was 2 people tall, wearing some unknown clothes. At that time, it was dark. Its eyes were as bright as torches, and it just stared at me. Then it pounced and tore off the head of the pack horse beside me. The blood sprayed all over my head and face. He stopped when he said this. The squad leaders were just listening to his story, entranced. At this time, they subconsciously asked, "And then?" Ding Min sighed. "Then I fainted. When I woke up later, I heard that the old demon only dragged the horse away. Other people also saw it. I was also exempted from punishment. But Sai, can ordinary people resist twisting the horse's head off?" Sumao looked at him in a daze. "Boss, you haven't fought with it before?" Ding Min raised his eyebrows. "If I fought with that thing, would I still be alive? That was an old demon. At that time, I heard that it was probably extremely hungry during winter, so it came out to look for food. But the military camp was full of yang energy, and it was afraid that it would harm the soldiers. So the Taoist priests and swordsmen in the nearby city went to kill it. So it only dragged the horse away. But now," Ding Min sighed heavily, "now it's not the same." Li Yunqin opened his eyes and glanced at them. This squad leader was just as Ding Min said. The old demon they met was probably just a small demon that had just taken human form. In his eyes, it was not even a small fish. But for ordinary people, it was indeed a very difficult opponent. Its body was as strong as a huge beast, and it had intelligence, and it might even know demonic magic. Hearing this, the 5 squad leaders seemed to be at a loss for words. The 5 of them had naturally heard rumors about demons, who hadn't? Chapter 377. But no one had actually seen it. By now, these officers should have already received the news, such as that they would encounter demons along the way. The orders passed down from the army were different from the rumors of the common people. This meant that those things really existed, and there was a high chance that they would encounter them. They say that evil will never triumph over good. Squad leader Sumao muttered to himself. His voice trembled slightly, as if he was afraid. Why are they saying that those demons are overturning the heavens? Why are they swarming like a swarm of bees to kill people? Didn't they say that Xing Wu is full of yang energy? Why don't the immortals care? Ding Min's expression didn't look good either. But as the commanding officer of this small squad, he couldn't be discouraged at this time. He shook his head. Those immortals, alas, they are high up in the sky. How can they see our little things? General Li's son is a big shot to us, but in the eyes of the immortals, he's nothing. Maybe if the demons run wild for a few more days, the immortals will care. Ding Min's expression was dark as he poked the fire. We have to hold on until then, and lead our brothers out of here safely. The 5 squad leaders seemed to agree with his explanation. They nodded in unison. They actually heaved a sigh of relief. But Li Yunqin only smiled. These soldiers, in their hearts, the cultivators of Daotong and Kenzo were immortals, omnipotent, and the embodiment of justice. But in reality, it wasn't that their immortals didn't know that they couldn't wipe out demons with a wave of their hands. They saw demons as evenly matched opponents. And the immortals weren't the kind of immortals they imagined. While he was listening to the conversation of the 5 low-level officers, he could also hear the conversation of the ordinary soldiers. And those soldiers didn't seem to know about the existence of demons. The terrifying inside information was only reported to the squad leaders. And the low-level officers didn't seem to be willing to tell the soldiers the truth in advance. They only said that they might encounter ferocious beasts and so on. Beasts were still within the realm of common sense. If they were told that there really were demons, there would probably be deserters halfway through. It was already late at night. These officers and soldiers had started a fire, boiled water, and baked pancakes to eat. Now that he had eaten and drunk his fill, he decided to rest. However, at this time, a few soldiers dug around under the fire for a while and pulled out a lump of mud. The soil had been burnt black by the fire, and the surface had become a hard shell. The soldier drew a dagger from his waist and struck the hard shell several times with the back of the dagger. The hard shell split open. Immediately, the smell of meat filled the air, causing many people to stare at it. Li Yunxin had been distracted by their idle chatter and found out that they had accidentally caught a rabbit when they were camping here. At this time of year, rabbits were putting on their autumn fat and beautiful. But when marching in the wilderness, there was a rule. Small groups were not allowed to eat meat at night. What he meant was that he was afraid that the smell of blood would attract wild beasts. But at this moment, he was probably more afraid of attracting demons. Because of this, the soldiers secretly wrapped it in mud and put it under the fire to burn. They only took it out now. Seeing this, Ding Min, Su Mao, and a few other officers came over to reprimand them. But in the end, they had a good relationship with the soldiers, so they let it go. An old soldier didn't mind the heat and tore off the hind leg for his officer to eat. But using this method to cook the rabbit, without peeling off the skin or removing the organs, how could it taste good? The officer naturally didn't want to eat it, but the soldiers didn't mind, and all rushed to eat it. In the blink of an eye, only a small part of the rabbit was left, and only some internal organs were left. Seeing them like this, the 6 officers' faces became slightly better. Perhaps it was such a lively and joyous scene that slightly diluted the haze in their hearts. They saw people again. It was at this time, a cold wind suddenly blew in the forest. This cold wind, even the most careless person would feel strange. The wind brushed against the tips of the grass, and although it wasn't strong, it blew the bonfires, making them flicker, as if they were about to be extinguished. Although it was a cold autumn night, this wind was even colder. It directly blew through the armor and thin cotton clothes, chilling them to the bone. As a result, the slightly noisy camp suddenly became strangely quiet. The soldiers looked at each other with unswallowed food in their mouths, and the 6 officers' faces were even worse. They immediately tightened their grip on the hilts of their swords and shouted at them to be alert. After the time of 3 breaths, the cold wind dissipated. The forest returned to peace, as if nothing had happened. But not far away, in the darkness of the forest, an old man slowly walked out. This old man's face was wrinkled to the point that his eyebrows couldn't be seen clearly, and his face was full of wrinkles. His sparse white hair was loosely tied up on top of his head, and only a few strands of his beard were left. But he wore a red robe and carried a wooden crutch. With one hand behind his back, he slowly walked towards the camp with his waist bent, looking as if a gust of wind could blow him over. When the soldiers saw that it was an old man, some of them didn't care and ignored him. Some of the people who believed in ghosts and gods stared at him in a daze. An old man suddenly appearing in the wilderness was always strange. Only the 6 officers who knew the inside story acted as if they were facing a great enemy. Ding Min pressed down on the dagger at her waist, stepped forward, and shouted at the old man in a low voice. "Who are you?" The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a few more steps, and when the 2 of them were less than 10 steps away, he squinted his eyes and smiled. "Hey, you young people, who are you?" His smile was kind, and his voice was hoarse and deep. He sounded like an ordinary old man. Ding Min and the squad leaders looked at each other and said in a low voice, "We are soldiers of the Daqing state." The old man squinted his eyes and smiled again. "Hey, soldiers of the Qing state, passing through my territory, why are you eating my food?" Ding Min was slightly stunned. Just as she was about to speak, she saw the old man point to the fire. "What you are eating is the treasure of my Aunt Hong. She sneaked out today, and now she is like this. Is she not going to make trouble for me?" His eyes turned and swept around. "She even burned my firewood. She ate my meat and burned my firewood, but she didn't give me any offerings." At this point he stopped smiling. He put the wooden crutch on the ground and angrily paused. "You young people don't respect ghosts and gods. Do you still want peace?" Hearing his words, the people looked at each other. Ding Min furrowed his brows and stared at the old man, then said, "You old man, sir. Who are you?" The old man said, Go see what's under your fire. The fire he was referring to was the fire that the soldiers had used to burn the rabbit. This matter came about in a strange and bizarre manner. Thus, without waiting for Ding Min's order, the soldiers next to the fire thought for a moment, and quickly used their spears to push the firewood to one side. The earth under the fire had been loosened, and what lay beneath was revealed. It turned out to be a small broken shrine. This thing seemed to have been buried under the shallow soil, and was only revealed now. The soldiers looked again with the help of the fire. The statue carved in the shrine. If it wasn't this old man, who else could it be? Some of the literate soldiers saw a line of blurred words engraved on the shrine. Lord God of the thick earth. They were shocked and couldn't speak for a while. Ding Min and the squad leaders also saw this thing. Their eyes were full of surprise. They already knew about the demons, so they naturally believed in ghosts and gods. Now that they encountered this, they naturally believed in it even more. But they only believed that this old man wasn't human. They didn't dare to believe that he was really the Lord God of the thick earth. Which meant, this old man was the local god of the earth. The officers already knew that they might encounter demons. Now that they saw this old man again, they felt a chill down their spine. Ding Min clenched her teeth and carefully asked, "Sir, are you really from this land? We are all rough people in the army. If we offended you." The old man waved his hand and rolled his eyes again. Forget it, forget it. After saying that, he glanced at the rabbit's bones and internal organs next to the fire. Suddenly his mouth wriggled. His face looked like it was about to change shape. He hurriedly turned his head away and coughed a few times in a pretentious manner. Li Yunqin had been watching coldly from the beginning. From the moment the cold wind swept past. Of course, he could see that it was a demonic wind. Its aura was mixed and impure, and its demonic energy was also low. It could be seen that the spirit that created this demonic wind was probably only at the realm of intent. It hadn't even transformed into a human form, and could only use a camouflage. At this moment when this earth turned around and coughed again, Li Yunqin saw clearly. How was it coughing? It was obviously seeing the bones and internal organs, smelling the young energy aroma of human cooking. It was so greedy that its camouflage couldn't hold on any longer. So it hurriedly turned its head, and the half of its face revealed its original form. It turned out to be an old fox with red fur, so old that only a few strands of its beard were left. It opened its mouth and licked its lips with its scarlet tongue, then coughed a few times and transformed back into a human face. It then turned its head again, squinted its eyes, and tried not to look at the food, and said, "Forget it, forget it. Do you soldiers know that there are many demons and monsters here, and all of them want to eat people? You all came here and didn't worship me. If you walk another 10 miles, you will definitely be captured." Then, its eyes turned and swept across the horses in the forest, and then looked at the goods piled up and said, "You all need to follow me. I will bring all of you to the west and take another path. Only then will you be safe." If it was a normal commoner or merchant group meeting such a person on such a night, they might have believed it. In this world, normal people feared ghosts and gods, unlike the prosperous world that Li Yunqin came from. As a result, some of the soldiers were terrified and took his words seriously. However, Ding Min started to frown. She thought about it silently for a while, holding onto the knife on her waist, and walked step by step toward the earth. When she was a step away from him, she stopped and bowed, saying, "Honorable God above." The night was dark. Using the darkness of the night, Ding Min's right hand reached into her sleeve. When these 4 words came out of her mouth, she suddenly straightened her back. There was a yellow talisman in her hand. Li Yunqin heard it from him before. She also knew that there was such a talisman along with the possible encounter with demons order. It was said to be able to chase away evil spirits and ghosts. Now that Li Yunqin finally saw it, he realized that it might be useful. However, it could only be used to deal with those real wandering ghosts and little demons with extremely low cultivation. It happened very quickly. Ding Min spat on the talisman, and then with lightning speed, she slapped it onto the earth's head. But with a loud howl, the old man's face, where the yellow talisman stuck, immediately rose a cloud of green smoke. How could he possibly endure this excruciating pain? His body flashed in the darkness, and with a buzz, he turned into smoke and disappeared. Once Ding Min succeeded, she knew that this was not a god, but a demon. He immediately drew the dagger from his waist and fiercely chopped in all directions, but he did not manage to hit anyone. Squad leader Su Mao also saw this scene. After being slightly startled, he immediately shouted, "There's a demon! There's a demon! Form the formation! Form the formation!" After this sound, a cold wind suddenly blew in the forest, making a whistling sound. The trees shook violently, as if they were about to topple over. The old fox was enraged. He first laughed cruelly, then his voice came from all directions. "You stupid men, how dare you hurt me? Waha." Chapter 378. When the demon revealed its true face, everyone was shocked. Su Mao said it was a demon, but how was it behaving like a human? Although this small group of soldiers were trained daily and had gone up the mountain to kill bandits, they couldn't help but feel afraid at this time. They were fighting humans before, but now they couldn't even see a shadow. They could only hear strange laughter and the bone-chilling wind around them. Where could they find the enemy? Thus, this group took a full 15 minutes to reorganize. However, at this time, they found that the 4 scouts on the periphery were gone. There were originally 2 open sentries and 2 hidden sentries. However, the 4 of them had disappeared without a trace, as if they had been abducted by some demon using a spell. Thus, there was a faint smell of blood in the air. Maybe it was the blood of the 4 scouts. Those who were able to be scouts were definitely quick-witted and agile. They were the elites of the team. Now that even such elites couldn't escape, everyone was even more frightened. But Ding Min used a talisman to break the illusion of the demon, and he felt much more at ease. He was an old soldier who had guarded the border and had conflicts with the border troops of the Yu and Yi countries. He was someone who had seen blood. Thus, he knew that this demon wasn't as powerful as the legends said. It was most likely a demon that had transformed into a human. There were many rumors about demons in the wilderness at the border. It was said that this kind of demon didn't have a high cultivation level and mostly used tricks to confuse people and then trap them to death. But right now, his group of dozens of people were all men with strong yang energy. Why should they be afraid of it? Thus he shouted, "We are the military reserve of the Daqing state. What we are doing is following the will of the heavens. And all of us are good men. Evil can never defeat good. So why should we be afraid of it? Don't you see that it only dares to bluff and doesn't dare to rush over?" Yen Air. The Yen Air he was shouting at was an archer who was killed by Su Mao's fire. All 10 of them used longbows, and each of them had the ability to shoot from both sides. This Yen Air was born in a hunter's family, but he had white skin and was good at shooting arrows. He was a disciple taught by Su Mao after he entered the army, so people jokingly called him the prodigal Yen Air. Yen Air was originally protecting Su Mao. Hearing that he was called, he immediately puffed out his chest and said, "Here." Ding Min heard that he was full of energy and was not afraid, so she praised him in her heart. Then he said, "All of you listen to my instructions. Shoot where I point." Just as he finished speaking, a fishy wind suddenly blew from the west side of the forest. Ding Min glared at them and shouted, "Fire!" 10 archers immediately knocked their arrows and shot over. After a series of whistling sounds that sounded like a torrential rain, a few howls suddenly rang out from the forest. These howls did not belong to humans, but to wild beasts and domestic dogs that had been injured. Hearing this sound, the soldiers were slightly relieved. Since it could be injured by bows and arrows, it must not be some extraordinary thing. When it came to sabers, horses, bows, and arrows, there was no one better than them in this world. As a result, Ding Min shouted again, "Saber and shield bearers, go and drag him back for me to see." Immediately, another 5 saber and shield bearers came out. They lowered their bodies and held their shields in front of them. Another 5 bearers with spears followed behind them and pushed them into the forest on the west side. At this time, the chilly wind had weakened a lot, but the fishy smell was getting stronger. In the forest, the old man from before was cursing again. It was nothing more than something like, "If you dare to hurt my children and grandchildren, I will make you die a horrible death." But now the people were not very afraid anymore. They just thought that he was bluffing. After a while, the saber and shield bearers and spear bearers, who went into the forest, came back. They were dragging 3 bloody creatures that were still whimpering and struggling. Everyone looked at them carefully. They were 3 old foxes. Ordinary foxes were slightly smaller than domestic dogs. But these 3 old foxes were the size of calves. Their whiskers were like steel needles. The 4 scouts from before were no longer breathing. They were probably ambushed and had their throats bitten off. But now these soldiers were armed and vigilant. The longbows used in the army were far more powerful than ordinary hunting bows. Even if these 3 old foxes had thick skin and great strength, they still couldn't handle 10 archers who had been trained for many years. One of them was pierced through the head and died on the spot. The other 2 were wounded in the waist and abdomen. They also didn't have any strength left. Ding Min pulled out his saber and stepped on the head of one of the foxes. The fox was in pain and struggled on its deathbed. It bit the back of his foot. But the fox was already on the verge of death and didn't have any strength left. Ding Min's army boots were also embedded with thin iron plates, so he wasn't afraid of it biting. He kicked its mouth open and stabbed the knife into its eye socket, stirring it a little. The old fox immediately stopped breathing. The soldiers cheered loudly. Their morale was boosted. Ding Min let another old fox out. He pointed his bloody saber at it and shouted, "Chop it up for me. Avenge our dead brothers." The soldiers cheered loudly. They pulled out their sabers and rushed forward. In an instant, the old fox was chopped into meat paste. At this point, no one was afraid of the chilly wind in the forest anymore. The old monster was chattering non-stop, but the soldiers were also shouting and cursing. They hit their sabers and shields, inviting the enemy to fight. Ding Min saw that the time was right and shouted, "The road to Tongtian Swamp is dangerous. It's hard to avoid encountering this kind of monster. But look carefully now. What kind of monster is afraid of the heavenly Tao? We have sabers, horses, bows and arrows in our hands. Even if the monster king comes, we'll kill him on sight." The soldiers cheered again. But although Ding Min said that, he didn't underestimate the enemy. He told them to gather together and didn't take the initiative to attack. After a short stalemate, pairs of green eyes appeared in the darkness of the forest. They were the eyes of a ferocious beast. There were more than 10 of them. They kept moving back and forth, as if they were looking for an opportunity. These were probably the descendants that the old fox had ordered. Ding Min stared at them. When she saw that they were a little denser, she immediately ordered the archers to shoot. But the foxes were smart and dodged quickly. After 4 rounds of shooting, only one was killed and one was injured. So Ding Min ordered the sabers and shields to guard the periphery, and gave Su Mao a look. The 2 of them had been friends for many years, and understood each other's intentions. Seeing the look in his eyes, he immediately raised his voice and asked Yin Er, "How many arrows are left?" Yin Er and a few archers checked. Just as he was about to say something, he saw Su Mao's look again. He quickly swallowed the words he was about to say and said in panic, "Not much, but there are only a few left. What should we do?" As soon as he said that, the old fox, who had turned into chilly wind and was wandering in the forest, laughed wildly and shouted, "Good, good, good. Children, go and tear them apart." As soon as he said that, more than 10 ferocious beasts the size of calves rushed out of the forest and fiercely pounced over. Li Yinxin had seen hundreds of people fighting a dozen demons in human form in Rong City. Although they did not have the advantage, they did not collapse at the first encounter. But now these 40 or so people were fully armed and well-trained elites, and they were only facing a dozen or so animals that understood human nature, so it was much easier. Seeing the ferocious beasts pounce over, Ding Min immediately ordered more arrows. At this time, without the protection of the darkness, their bodies were completely exposed. Yin Er and the other archers showed their best skills. A series of arrows were shot out like a storm. The arrows pierced through the eyes of the beasts and 3 of them were instantly taken down. The remaining beasts saw that the situation was not good and turned to pounce from the side. In the end, they were greeted by another rain of arrows, and another 2 or 3 beasts fell. The remaining beasts finally broke through to the front of the formation. However, The shields used by the Qing Kingdom's armed forces were tower shields that were half the height of a person. They poked and stood on the ground, immediately forming a solid wall. When the ferocious beasts pounced, a row of spears suddenly poked out from behind the shield wall and immediately pierced through the hearts of the beasts. In less than a quarter of an hour, like a storm, the dozen beasts were completely slaughtered, but they were not injured at all. The old fox demon also seemed to be stunned. He floated in the forest for a long time without saying anything. Of course, he had never seen this kind of formation. The power of the Yi Kingdom could not compare to that of the Qing Kingdom, and the monarch was not a talented and bold monarch. Although the Qing emperor could not be said to be a rare hero, he was still better than the Yi Kingdom. Additionally, the Qing Kingdom was rich, and the armed forces were well equipped and well trained. The old fox demon had lived in the forest for many years. Although his reputation was impressive, he usually only saw merchants and bandits. He had never seen the killing methods of professional soldiers. Thus, at this moment, seeing his children and grandchildren all slaughtered, the viciousness in his heart was finally aroused. It was not that he did not have other methods. He just did not want to use them. He had originally been a wild fox who had achieved enlightenment and cultivated his intelligence. He pretended to be mysterious and displayed his magical powers nearby. In the end, he tricked the ignorant mountain people into giving him a position as a god of the land. Then, he enjoyed some scattered incense and spent hundreds of years before he was able to take human form. For a demon to take human form, it took a great deal of demonic power. The old fox's cultivation was at a bottleneck and had not completed it. Thus, at this time, he knew that the great demons were going to stop the passing human carriages. Only then did he have evil intentions. He wanted to do it himself and ask for a reward from the great demons. If a miraculous elixir were to be tossed over, his transformation would be guaranteed. Who would have thought that he would run into a difficult opponent and lose a large number of his children and grandchildren? How could he endure this? Because of this anger, he became even more daring. Even if he had to sacrifice more than 10 years of cultivation, he had to make these hateful people stay. Thus he abruptly cried out, "What a group of evil thieves! Come and have a taste of my chaotic mystic yellow wind." As soon as he finished speaking, there was a loud bang. No one knew what kind of magical power he had used, but suddenly, a gust of dark green ghostly aura surged out from the forest and rushed towards the soldiers. This ghostly aura was really scary. When people saw it, their eyes would immediately tear up. Once they breathed it in, they would immediately feel dizzy, as if their mouth and nose were on fire. What was more frightening was that this smell was extremely stinky. There were no words in the world that could describe its smell. These soldiers were not afraid of blood and swords, but this was something that no one could endure. For a moment, coughing and vomiting sounds could be heard. The swords, spears, and shields in their hands fell to the ground. 3 or 4 of them had already fainted from the smell. But in fact, they were not the only ones who suffered. Li Yunxin was originally sitting under a big tree in the distance, calmly watching the show. He used to be a human, so he was not as heartless to humans as the demons. But now that he was a demon, he was not like a human who would shout and kill whenever he saw a demon. He did not know these soldiers. He originally wanted to wait for them to be surrounded by the demons, and some of them to die before he acted. What could be more trustworthy than saving someone's life? But who would have thought that while he was sitting there peacefully, that old demon fox would fly into a rage out of humiliation and suddenly make a chaotic mystic yellow wind? This was not some dog fart chaotic mystic yellow wind. It was clearly that old fox's old fart. Thinking about the days that he, Li Yunxin, had roamed the Jianghu, everyone admired his good name and gave him the nickname Jade-Faced Little Silver Dragon. When had he ever heard anyone's fart? He was instantly enraged, even more enraged than that old fox. He held his breath and jumped up from under the tree. As he cursed, he walked towards the camp. At this time, that old demon fox saw that his chaotic mystic yellow wind was finally effective. Those soldiers were all lying on the ground. He gritted his teeth and laughed loudly as he reappeared. Leaning on his wooden crutch, he walked over quickly like the wind. He looked at the soldiers one by one and cursed, What a group of evil thieves! How many of my descendants have you killed? Today, I will hang all of you on a tree to dry. I will let you suffer for 49 days. As he cursed, he suddenly saw Ding Min, who was lying on the ground, widen his eyes. His face was twisted as he looked behind him. This place was still covered by his chaotic mystic yellow wind. The clouds and fog made it difficult for him to see clearly. When the old demon fox saw Ding Min's expression, he leaned forward and pretended to use his hand to dig out his eyes. I'll let you see. I'll first eat your 2 crystal pills. As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly heard someone behind him curse loudly. You crazy bastard! You dare to let me smell your fart? This shout startled the old fox. Before Ding Min could figure out where this person came from, and when did he appear behind her, the young man in white robes behind her had already raised his hand and slapped the back of her head. This slap made a bang sound. The old demon fox, who had been proud of himself for half an incense stick's time, didn't even have time to see who was behind him. His melon-shaped head had already exploded from the slap. Blood, brain matter, broken bones, and flesh splashed onto the wild grass. The old demon fox's body swayed slightly and fell to the ground with a thud, revealing his original form. Since the fox demon was dead, the fog in the forest immediately dissipated. In just 2 or 3 breaths, the wind was clear and the moon was bright again. This sudden turn of events caused everyone to be dumbfounded. More than 40 soldiers stared at Li Yunxin, speechless for a long time. The white-robed young man clapped his hands in disgust, wiping away the blood stains on his hands. Then he looked up at them and suddenly smiled. Don't be afraid. I'm not a good person either. Chapter 379. After he said this, the smile on his face suddenly disappeared. He abruptly put his hands behind his back and stared fiercely at them. You are the Qing Kingdom's military reserve army, huh? Ding Min froze for a moment before she felt her numb and swollen lips regain some feeling. However, his throat was still boiling hot, and every breath he took was a burning pain. He opened his mouth and said in a raspy voice, We are. That's good. Every debt has its debtor. Li Haihai, that bastard's debt. You can pay for it. Li Yunxin angrily paced a few steps and saw the old fox's body on the ground. He angrily kicked it aside. Little bastard, you coaxed me here and almost lost my life. All of you. Since your lives were saved by me, your descendants are also mine. From today onwards, until I see that cloud mountain, you will not leave my side and protect me. Li Haihai was a person's name. This name belonged to the youngest son of General Li of the Qing Kingdom. He was also the person that Ding Min and Su Mao had spoken of earlier. The person who had insisted on taking hundreds of riders on the winding mountain path and ended up being completely annihilated. Now this white-clothed young man had unceremoniously called Li Haihai by his name and even called him a bastard. His identity seemed to be clear. Ding Min turned her head with difficulty and met Su Mao's gaze. She then looked at Li Yunxin. Sir escaped from the Tiger Guards? Li Yunxin's eyebrows shot up. What Tiger Guards? There's no need to test me. Let me tell you, it was the subjugation army that went into Redstone Gorge with that bastard Li Haihai. The general's surname was Xue, and there was some commander. That group of idiots, humph. They told me to protect him on the way to Cloud Mountain. On the way, they could go sightseeing and have their daily needs taken care of. In the end, they had to go into the gorge. They were all eaten by a group of demons and monsters. Previously, only the 6 officers knew of this news. The soldiers did not know. Now that Li Yunxin had said it all in one breath, the soldiers lying on the ground were all stunned. Thousands of soldiers were eaten by demons and ghosts. But at this moment, he didn't think it was nonsense anymore. Weren't their group also defeated by the fox demon? Ding Min blinked for a long time before she struggled to prop herself up. Daoist, General Xue and Deputy Commander Lu are really dead, all dead. Those who managed to escape did not have much chance of survival. Humph. Li Yunxin took 2 more steps, looked at these people, and frowned in disgust. Useless things. With that said, he waved his hand, and a magic brush appeared in his palm. Then he drew something in the air with the brush, and it began to drizzle. Although it looked like rain, It was actually a green light that was as thick as a cow's hair. As the green light descended, it quickly entered the bodies of the soldiers. In just 2 breaths, the burning pain in their throats, mouths, and noses disappeared. Even the soreness and weakness in their bodies disappeared. Li Yunxin had behaved like a bastard, and his words were annoying. When he said that these people were useless, many people glared at him. But now that he showed such supernatural power, the soldiers immediately widened their eyes and looked at him, as if they were looking at a god. As people in the secular world, the so-called Taoist magic of immortals that they could come into contact with was probably the most brilliant. But he didn't care about this person's reaction. He just frowned and said, "I'm tired. Prepare a place for me to rest. Let's go early tomorrow." He had only appeared for 15 minutes, and he didn't say more than a dozen sentences. But he was like the commander of an army, giving orders without hesitation. But this kind of behavior dispelled much of the doubts in Ding Min and the 5 squad leaders' hearts. They had all seen the despicable behavior of those high officials and nobles, and it was exactly the same as this Taoist master in front of them. Therefore, after a quarter of an hour, Li Yunxin was lying comfortably next to the bonfire. He was leaning on the red soil bag that was used for transportation. On top of it was a layer of winter quilt, which was used by the army to keep out the wind, and was somewhat comfortable. He closed his eyes slightly, pretending to meditate and regulate his breath. But in fact, he was listening to the soldiers, because he slowly realized something else. It seemed that it was time for him to enter the secular world. When the Taoist priests and swordsmen of Cloud Mountain cultivated to a certain level, they faced 2 choices. If they had the conditions, they would use the treasured picture scrolls in their sect to go through tribulations and understand. If they didn't have the conditions, they would have to go into the secular world. In the past, Li Yunxin could barely be considered as a person in the secular world. But he was confined to a small world, and it couldn't be considered as training in the secular world. But at that time, his talent was extraordinary, and he didn't need to go through any tribulations. But at this time, his supreme oblivion was broken, and a lot of troublesome things started to happen. 2 hours ago, he ran away from Bai Yunxin on the cliff. If it was in the past, how could such a thing happen? There were no obvious signs of the arrival of emotions, desires, and tribulations. Many people even fell deep into the tribulations and didn't know it until the last moment. Hesitation and confusion might just be a momentary loss of self-control. Or it could be that your tribulations have come. Li Yunxin didn't have a teacher, so he didn't know how to go through tribulations and what they were. But in fact, even the cultivators in Cloud Mountain Xianmen who had teachers, at the level of the true state, who could say that they had full confidence in guiding him in terms of the state of mind. Cultivation was not a safe thing to do. Therefore, he spent a little effort to run to this group of soldiers. First, he wanted to see what this red soil was. Second, he wanted to quietly sneak into Xuanmen's camp to observe the environment. Third, he just wanted to get along with more people. To get along with these ordinary, lowly mortals who had sadness and joy. With his current state, he was different from the past. Therefore, he could hear the conversation between Ding Min and Su Mao next to the bonfire in the distance. This Taoist doesn't look like a good person. Su Mao glanced at Li Yunxin worriedly, then quickly looked away. Did you see him kill someone? As he said this, the other 4 squad leaders echoed. None of them climbed up the ranks by relying on their background or power. If they really had a background or power, who would do this kind of job? They had all started out as foot soldiers, gaining experience, accumulating military merits, and slowly being promoted. Therefore, they understood very well the look in a person's eyes when he killed someone. But they couldn't understand the look in this Taoist's eyes when he killed. There was no fluctuation at all, as if he was killing a scarecrow. This made them feel cold from the bottom of their hearts. Ding Min frowned and thought for a while, then shook her head. He didn't kill people. He was a demon. Besides, have you seen a Taoist? He looked at the 5 squad leaders. Not those wild Taoists who walk the streets, but Taoist priests stationed in the city. Or have you seen a great painter? Think about it. What do those people look like? He paused. Do they look the same as this Taoist? Their faces look like they're asking for a beating. He lowered his voice when he said the last sentence, but it caused the 5 squad leaders to chuckle after a momentary pause. Therefore, the atmosphere eased up a little. Dingmin continued. I've seen him once. That time, I went to the capital with AI Deputy Commander Liu. I caught a glimpse of a Taoist priest from the Taoist sect in the distance. His expression and behavior were similar to this one. Those people can't be treated as humans. Since he saved us, he must be a Taoist priest. He also mentioned the names of General Shui and Zhichongjun, as well as the name of Great General Li's young marquis. I think there's no mistake in his identity. This kind of person usually doesn't have much interaction with us and doesn't care about us at all. This kind of behavior can't be more normal. AI. Dingmin sighed again. It was difficult for us to deal with that demon, and he killed it with one slap. Since our brothers know about the demon, they must be afraid. We don't know what else we'll encounter in the next few days. In my opinion, we should endure him for a few days and coax him to travel with us. Once we leave the mountains and see the army, he'll naturally leave, and we'll be able to preserve our lives. With his ability, if he really wanted to harm us, why would he need to go through so much trouble? Dingmin's words were reasonable, and slowly dispelled the last shred of doubt in the 5 squad leaders' hearts. Compared to them, Dingmin could be considered someone who had seen much of the world. He had accompanied Deputy Commander Liu to the capital. Since he said this, the matter was probably as he had said. Only then did they disperse and pacify the soldiers. Dingmin thought for a while, then quietly walked to the side of Li Yunxin's bed, and stood there quietly for a while. Li Yunxin's eyes were closed the entire time, and he looked like he was dozing off. He didn't pay any attention to him. After a quarter of an hour, Dingmin was finally about to leave. However, he heard Li Yunxin say lazily, If you have something to say it. Do you want to see through this old Taoist? Dingmin took a step forward, took out the water pouch from his waist, held it with both hands, and carefully handed it to Li Yunxin. Master Immortal saved our brothers' lives. But now we have nothing to repay Master Immortal. I don't think our things can enter Master Immortal's discerning eyes. I do have a pouch of wine here. It's brewed by my wife, and it's stored in a new wine pouch. I couldn't bear to drink it along the way, so I didn't open the cork or touch it. If Master Immortal is thirsty and doesn't mind. After saying this, Li Yunxin ignored him. He left him alone for another half an incense stick's time, then opened one of his eyes, glanced at him and yawned. At least you're filial. He snorted, then sat up. He frowned slightly and looked at the wine pouch in Dingmin's hands. Although it was new, according to the noble's standards, the craftsmanship was very rough. He looked at it for a while, then used 2 fingers to pull the cork open. Then he sniffed. Following that, his brows relaxed. You still have such a good thing. He suddenly became happy. With a hook of his finger, the wine in the pouch turned into a line and entered his throat. It was unknown if he was deliberately showing off, or if he really thought it was dirty, but when the soldiers in the distance saw his method, they were all dumbfounded, clicking their tongues in wonder, as if they had really seen a miracle. These ordinary people had never seen with their own eyes a method that surpassed their knowledge. Tonight, it could be considered as the first time they confirmed that there were indeed other powers in this world that they didn't understand. Li Yunxin drank half the wine pouch in one go, and his mood seemed to be a little better. But he snorted again. You're 10,000 times more filial than that bastardly Hai. Hey, what's your name again? I'm Dingmin, Commander of the Fire Battalion's 2nd Brigade, 3rd Platoon. Master Immortal, how should I address you? Li Yunxin rolled his eyes. This old Taoist's Taoist name is Hunyuanzi. This old Taoist will ask you again, where are you going, and how many people are going? He acted like an expert who didn't care about the affairs of the world. Only now that he was in trouble, did he finally remember to care about these minor details. Dingmin didn't suspect anything, and very quickly told him most of the matter. Because it wasn't some military operation that needed to be kept secret. The whole world knew about the transportation of red soil to Tongtian Swamp. The only difference was where it was delivered, and where the various armies were assembled. And when Li Yunxin asked this question, he realized, oh my, this was serious. He had previously thought that the human imperial court didn't send an army to escort the transportation, probably because the human emperors didn't really want to put in effort. But after hearing Ding Min's words, he realized that he was completely wrong. It wasn't that they didn't put in effort. According to what he said, these days, there were already many small troops like them passing through this endless mountain range. In 10 to 10 days, there were already nearly 30,000 troops passing through. Chapter 380. The reason they didn't assemble a large force was because General Li's son, Li Haihai's fate was right there. A large force would attract the demons' attention, and if they weren't careful, they would be completely wiped out. On the other hand, the many small teams would distract the demons' attention and cause them to run all over the place, which would allow more people to survive. Hearing this, Li Yunxin sighed in his heart. They were going to cause trouble. Looking at the situation, there would probably be hundreds of thousands of mortal troops gathered in Tongtian Swamp. Hundreds of thousands for a war, it was a terrifying number. In the history of his previous world, there had also been a large-scale war of this scale. However, that was often when the number of people in support was counted. Although it was said to be hundreds of thousands, there were only tens of thousands of soldiers. But now, the Qing kingdom had sent more than 30,000 soldiers. These professional soldiers could almost start a war to destroy a small country like the Yu kingdom. Adding on the armies of the other countries, there would be another big problem. What were they going to eat and drink? Since they had to cross mountains to transport things, they wouldn't bring much rations. It would probably only be enough for them to walk to Tongtian Swamp. In this era, the transportation ability was low. A large city didn't even have a population of 1 million. To support an army of hundreds of thousands, it might need millions of people in support. The amount of food and drink every day was shocking. A medium-sized country like the Yi Kingdom probably couldn't bear such a burden. At most, it could last for 10 days. But looking at it, it would be more than 10 days before Yin Shan landed in Tongtian Swamp. Once it came to that, the army would be short of food and clothing, and morale would be shaken. Moreover, the allied armies of the various countries were not united. Perhaps they would become a burden instead of a fighting force. Daotong and Kenzo, what would they do? Li Yunxin suddenly thought of the city of Weicheng. In the city of Weicheng, Yunzi killed tens of thousands of people to form a formation. After that, the people of the Lengjia Grotto Heaven destroyed an entire city to form a formation. The people of the Xianmen were also not good people. Unless they, for some reason, this thought made Li Yunxin feel very uncomfortable. Burning down the city of Weicheng was a small matter. It could always be covered up. He could even blame it on the demons. However, if these hundreds of thousands of soldiers were used to form a formation in Yi country, this world would no longer belong to Daotong or Kenzo. The imperial court in the secular world would become enemies with them. At that time, when the mortal kingdoms and the mystical sects attacked, would the cultivators kill them or not? After killing people, the celestial beings told them to shepherd the people. With such a thing happening, the celestial society would probably be enraged once again. Wasn't it said that the last time he angered the heavens, there was no immortal decree for 1,000 years, almost causing the inheritance of the celestial sect of wonders to be severed? However, Li Yunxin was not very clear about what kind of existence the so-called celestial being was, and how powerful they were. He still needed to know more. In fact, he had already formed a faint conjecture in his heart. Therefore, after talking with Ding Min for a while, he sent him away impatiently. Ding Min naturally wanted to ask about his background in detail, but Li Yunxin glared at him and raised his eyebrows. How could he dare to ask? He was a hot-blooded soldier, but there was no need for him to use it on Li Yunxin. The night passed reluctantly. Originally, the soldiers first saw the old monster, and then saw the means of the Taoist priest Hun Yuanzi, so it was difficult for them to calm down. However, after going through a fierce battle, they were also very tired. In the end, after burying the bodies of the 4 dead comrades, they fell into a deep sleep. Su Mao, on the other hand, pretended to sleep in the middle of the night, only staring at Li Yunxin's every move. However, Li Yunxin was meditating. The concentration of a cultivator was not comparable to that of a mortal. He sat there for the whole night without moving an inch. When the sun was about to rise, Su Mao also fell asleep. Then, the morning fog gradually dissipated, birds chirped, and rays of sunlight shone through the gaps between the branches and leaves. A new day had arrived. After a little rest, the small team set off again. The noble Taoist priest naturally could not walk, so he rode a pack horse. This pack horse had short legs, so it walked much more steadily than a military horse. Su Mao was the vanguard. The other squad leaders brought up the rear, and Ding Min and Li Yunxin walked in the middle of the team. However, today's march was not as easy as the previous few days. First, it was because someone died last night. Second, it was because everyone knew that the demons really existed, and it was very likely that they would come again. Therefore, after walking for about 2 hours, Ding Min also felt that something was wrong. Although he was good at leading troops, he was not good at ideological work. He only thought that if they could meet another demon and ask this Hunyuanzi Taoist priest to kill it, perhaps their morale would be boosted. They walked gloomily for the whole morning. When it was noon, they found a mountain call to take shelter from the wind and rested there. They started a fire to cook. The soldiers gathered in 2s and 3s to eat, and then talked about what happened last night, inevitably revealing a sense of dejection in their words. Occasionally, wild beasts passed through the forest, making noises. There were also people who grabbed their weapons in a panic to be on guard. Ding Min sighed. She broke the biscuit in her hand and frowned. If this continues, we won't last more than a few days. We haven't even walked out of this mountain, and the people's morale is already gone. If we encounter something else, I'm afraid that even if we fought before, we won't be able to fight now. Su Mao was silent at the side. He only stared at the dejected soldiers. After watching for a while and hearing them describe the demons as more and more terrifying, he suddenly frowned and shouted loudly, "What are you afraid of?" Was there anyone who thought that they would definitely die peacefully in bed when they joined the army and fought a war? My ancestors joined the army during the founding war of the Daqing state. An army of tens of thousands of brothers. 80 to 90% of them died in a month. Do you think we don't fight anymore? Last night, when we fought against that old demon, none of us were cowards. Now that we have walked out safely, have you lost your guts? As soon as he shouted, the soldiers stopped talking and shrank their heads. But after a while, someone suddenly said, "Squad leader, we are not afraid of death. We are just afraid of dying in vain. That demon is not something that we can deal with. Are we going to Tongtian Swamp to fight against the demon?" Su Mao stared at the person who spoke. "Ning Hutu, you are usually the most courageous one. Are you scared out of your wits today?" Being called out by Su Mao, the soldier named Ning Hutu stopped hiding. He also straightened his neck. "Granduncle, I am not scared out of my wits. I just don't want to hit a stone with an egg." Su Mao was furious. He jumped up and pointed at him. "Little bastard, what did you say? Do you know that you are disturbing the morale of the army? You will be killed on the battlefield without saying a word." Ding Min sighed, stood up and pulled him back. "Okay. It is not a battlefield now." Seeing that his young granduncle was angry, Ning Huda sat down embarrassedly. But the others looked even more depressed. Someone even talked about the state of you. It is said that the state of you is now occupied by demons. Even the emperor of the state of you has to listen to the demons. Those demons even eat the officials. This was a half-truth, but the problem was that few of the more than 40 soldiers knew the situation of the state of you. It was not convenient to travel in this era, and there were not many channels of information. Moreover, the two countries were separated by a long range of mountains. For a moment, the small camp was gloomy and gloomy. It seemed that even the bonfire could not drive away the chill of autumn. But suddenly he heard someone laughing. "A bunch of idiots." Li Yunxin sat on a bag of red soil covered with a quilt. He pinched a handful of red soil in his hand and sneered. "Don't you know that mortals also have magical powers? Don't you know that all of you are now practicing this magical power?" The mysterious but bad-tempered Taoist master was originally sitting far away from the group of dirty soldiers. enjoying scones and wine alone. Now that he suddenly said such a thing, everyone was stunned for a moment. If ordinary people said this, they would definitely be pressed to the ground and beaten up by these soldiers. But when Li Yunqin said this, no one responded. They had all seen his methods. Perhaps they were unwilling, but they knew that he was a real master. Although the words of a master were unpleasant to hear, they should be reasonable, right? After a moment of awkward silence, someone suddenly said loudly, "What is the magical power that Taoist master is talking about? Why don't we know about it?" Everyone looked at the person who spoke. It turned out to be the soft-skinned yin heir. They did not know what was wrong with this kid. At this moment, he actually became bold, and his tone was somewhat unconvinced. But in fact, Su Mao knew that among the 4 scouts who died last night, one of them was Yin Heir's best friend. Thus he was depressed the whole day. Now that he heard Li Yunqin's sarcastic words, he could not control his temper. But this Taoist master might be in a good mood today. Or perhaps he wanted to show off. So he did not get angry. Instead, he lazily leaned against the red soil bag and narrowed his eyes at them. TSK, let me ask you. An ordinary village brute would find it difficult to fight a vicious wolf, and might even lose his life. But how did you kill over a dozen fierce beasts last night? If this brute later joined the army, and became some kind of captain. When he said this, he raised his hand and pointed at Ding Min. Now, this captain remembers that he was injured by a vicious wolf, and wants to take revenge. Wouldn't it be easy to take you 40 idiots back to find that vicious wolf and kill it? If this captain later becomes the emperor, the Qing emperor. At this point, Ding Min turned pale with fright. She quickly waved her hand and said in a low voice, "Taoist Hun Yuanzi, you can't say such things carelessly." But Li Yunqin completely ignored her, and only continued to say, "After he becomes the emperor, he is now very unhappy with the Yu kingdom. So with one order, with just one sentence, thousands of troops and horses came out in full force and flattened the Yu kingdom in one night. Is that still a difficult matter? At this point, think about it again. In the past, he was just a brute who couldn't even defeat a vicious wolf. Later, with just one sentence he destroyed a country. In the eyes of that wolf, isn't this an incredible magic?" When Li Yunqin said this, everyone was stunned. Even Ding Min didn't say anything, and only furrowed her brows slightly. He sneered. "The divine abilities that I cultivate and the demons and devils cultivate are called spells. And the magic that this brute cultivates is called politics. You're born as humans, so you're used to the supernatural power of politics, and you're used to it. Until last night, when you saw the demon's magic, you felt it was incomprehensible and terrifying. But think about it. When those normal beasts saw you dozens of people walking together for no reason, working together to divide the work and kill, did they not find it incomprehensible and terrifying? This worldly people's magic of politics has been cultivated to the peak. For example, your Qing emperor 500 years ago changed dynasties and became emperor. Immortals overturned rivers and seas with the raising of their hands and feet. Could your emperor not use one sentence to flatten mountains and fill rivers? This Ding Min only needs one sentence to have you all kill and die. Does no one find it strange?" After saying this, he snorted and went back to minding his own business and drinking his wine. It was the soldiers in the camp who looked at each other. After a while, they reacted and whispered to each other. No one had ever thought of what Li Yunqin had said. Although it sounded absurd and uninhibited, thinking about it carefully, it made some sense. In this world, other than humans, what other animal could create dynasty after dynasty, build city after city, be equipped with armor like them, and kill a dozen ferocious beasts unscathed? Could it be that it was already very mystical, but he had gotten used to it? Regardless of whether these soldiers thought it through or not, after hearing Li Yunqin's words, some courage grew in their hearts, even if the situation had not changed, and they were still the same as last night. Ding Min froze for a long time before he walked in front of Li Yunqin and cupped his hands in salute. "Ding Min has benefited greatly from your words. It is also thanks to your words that these children..." Li Yunqin twitched his mouth. "I can't be bothered to cheer you on. It's just that I see you are filial, and can't bear to see a group of idiots ruin my mood. He looked young but always said that Ding Min, a man who had already passed his prime, was filial. Ding Min did not care. He had seen the world and knew that these cultivators only looked young. This Taoist priest Han Yuanzi's personality was actually very similar to the old man and his family. When people get old, their temperaments become strange, and they become more like children. This Taoist priest Han Yuanzi should be in his 60s or 70s. His cultivation is profound after all. Ding Min thought so in his heart. Thus he only bowed again, took 3 steps back and walked away. When he returned to the fire and sat down, he felt that the atmosphere was much livelier. Su Mao glanced at Li Yunxin and said to Ding Min, "This Taoist master doesn't have a bad heart." Ding Min smiled shamefully. "I thought that he really wanted us to serve him. That's why he saved us. But now, he killed an old monster with one slap. This kind of old immortal doesn't need anyone to serve him. Maybe he is afraid that we will encounter demons again and wants to protect us." After saying this, he thought for a while and said, "I think so. What do you think?" "I hope so." Su Mao frowned slightly. It can be said that he saw General Shui and his men being slaughtered by demons, but was powerless to do anything. Now he feels guilty. It can be said that he has other intentions, but he doesn't look like a bad person. In my opinion, boss, let's... At this time, they suddenly heard rustling sounds coming from the west side of the forest. It did not sound like a beast. Then, a soldier in tattered clothes rushed out of the forest. Seeing their camp, he was slightly surprised at first and then shouted, "Run! There are demons!" Chapter 381. If this soldier had appeared earlier, before Li Yunxin had said those words, perhaps one word would have caused chaos in the camp. But at this moment, Li Yunxin's words were still ringing in their ears. Seeing him like this and hearing his words, the soldiers did not panic. Instead, everyone first looked at Taoist Han Yuanzi, and then at his team leader. But the deserter had no intention of arguing with them. The shout was probably a subconscious reaction. Seeing that they were indifferent, he ignored them and jumped down the hill, about to pass through their camp. At that time, they could see his appearance clearly. Based on the style of his armor, he did not seem to be a soldier of the Qing kingdom. There were bloodstains on his shoulders and legs, which did not look like his own. He held a short knife in his hand, but the knife was clean. It was obvious that he had turned and fled when he saw that the situation was not good. Thus, it was fine that he did not have a weapon. But since he had a knife, how could they let him pass through the camp with a weapon? If a soldier from another country had rushed over like this, they would have shot him on the spot without saying anything. But because they had seen demons before, Ding Min only shouted in a low voice, "Take him down!" Taking him down was easy. He was already staggering when he ran. A soldier stretched out his leg and tripped, immediately falling flat on his face. When he tried to get up again, 2 big men had already pressed down on him and held him down. This guy was probably really scared. He immediately struggled with all his might, shouting, "There's a demon! Can't you hear me? If you don't want to live, let me go!" Ouch! As he shouted, he struggled with all his might. The 2 people actually could not hold him down. Su Mao immediately got up and walked to his side. He bent down and gave him 4 slaps. Slap, 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 slap. He immediately became dizzy and did not shout anymore. Then he looked at him sternly. "Where are you from? What demon did you meet? Where are you? Where are your people?" But the soldier was stunned for a moment. He could only stare at him, unable to speak. Ding Min also stood up and slightly frowned. From his accent, he should be from the Yi Kingdom. Then she turned her head and looked around. Suddenly her expression changed. "Get up!" Footsteps could be heard in the forest. It sounded like there were a lot of people, but it was not chaotic. Rustling sounds could be heard as they passed through the forest with withered leaves. For a moment, it was impossible to tell how many people there were. For scouts had died last night, and they only stopped for a short rest at noon, so they did not send out any scouts. After hearing Ding Min's words, everyone picked up their armors and weapons. Just as they stood up, they suddenly saw a flash of cold light in the forest. It should be the sunlight reflected off the bright ironware. In the next moment, with a swoosh, an arrow pierced through the air, pierced through the gap between the two soldiers who were pressing down on the soldier from Yi country, and nailed him to the ground. This arrow was different from the arrows used by the Qing soldiers. The shaft was thicker and longer, and the tail feathers were black. At this moment, the two men who were holding down the soldier were dumbfounded. They saw that half of the arrow had sunk into the ground, and the tail was buzzing and trembling incessantly. This arrow was sharp and ruthless. It hit the soldier right in the middle of his back, immediately killing him. Earlier, this soldier had rushed into the camp in a panic, which was already a great taboo in marching. Now the person who fired the arrow had killed the captive in their camp with one arrow. It was practically a declaration of war without saying anything else. Seeing that it was the method of mortals and not some evil magic, these Qing soldiers were not very afraid. A few squad leaders gave the order, and the 40 or so people immediately formed a formation. The archers under Su Mao's command did not say anything. They drew their bows and shot a round of arrows into the forest. This round was not to hurt people, but to suppress the momentum of the newcomers. As expected, they immediately heard someone shout in the forest. "How dare you shoot? How dare you? Where are you from?" Hearing this accent, Ding Min and Su Mao looked at each other and said in a low voice, "People from Li." Li was the largest country in the world, and it was separated from Qing by a narrow and long Yi country. But this did not mean that the two sides did not border each other. The territory of the Li kingdom stretched out to the south from the east, bordering both the Yi kingdom and the Qing kingdom. It was like a knife stuck into the bodies of both countries. Ding Min had been guarding the border before, and she had been guarding that border. The Li military was strong, and there were usually no large-scale wars between the countries, so the soldiers often caused trouble. Occasionally causing trouble at the border was something that the generals tacitly agreed to. Because there was no war in the world, soldiers had to be trained. Soldiers could not always be trained to fight bandits. In the eyes of the regular army, bandits were no different from newly captured able-bodied men. Thus, there were occasional small conflicts at the border, and they were some kind of practice that both sides agreed on. Ding Min knew that because the Li kingdom was in the north, the people of the Li were taller and thicker than the people of Yi and Qing. They were also rude and unreasonable. This could be seen from the arrows they used. The shafts of the arrows were all longer and thicker than those of the Qing army. The position they were in was actually not very far from the border of the Li kingdom. So, it was not strange for the soldiers of the Li kingdom to appear here. Just now, it was indeed their arrogant and unreasonable style. But, why did they kill the soldiers of Yi country? Ding Min raised her hand and told the archers to stop shooting. Then she said in a loud voice, "This is under the banner of the fire battalion of the Daqing State's Zhichong army. Which Li side is in the forest?" There was no immediate response. After about 10 breaths of time, a figure slowly appeared in the forest. From a glance, there were a lot of people. There were nearly 100 of them. These people stood on the hill with the sun behind them, looking down from above. They wore black armor and leather helmets. However, the leather helmets were pressed very low, and the contours of their faces were sharp and angular. Thus, they appeared to have a stern and cold aura. There were about 20 archers with bows drawn and arrows aimed at them. There were also about 40 heavily armored soldiers. Ding Min recognized the attire of the Li army's heavily armored cavalry. However, they were in the forest right now, so they had probably abandoned their horses and walked. The rest were sword and shield bearers and long spear bearers. There was not much difference in the configuration of the Qing army. However, these people looked at them coldly and did not speak. They were also larger than the Qing army. In this autumn afternoon, they formed a pressure that made it difficult for one to breathe. This stalemate continued for another 15 minutes. Only then did a sturdy man wearing full armor walk to the front of the forest. His chin was shaved black. He first glanced at Li Yunxin, and then at Ding Min. In a loud voice he said, "You are very daring. You dare to shoot arrows at the Li army. The fire battalion of the Zhichong army? Ha ha ha." Speaking to this point he laughed loudly. Does anyone still have the face to mention this name? Thousands of people being wiped out in one wave in Red Stone Gorge is already the joke of the various armies. You southern barbarians can't fight, but you're good at sending yourself to death. After he said this, the Qing army immediately became angry. Ding Min raised his hand again, and did not allow them to speak. He only said with a stern face, I am Captain Ding Min. Which dutu are you? The military system of the Li army was different from that of the Qing army. 100 people formed a capital with a dutu. Looking at their numbers, it should be the military strength of a capital. Yen Er said angrily from within the formation. Leader, what are these bastards saying? Let me teach them a lesson. Ding Min tilted her face slightly and said in a low voice, Hold your arrows well. These people are difficult to deal with. What he wanted to say was, we are not a match for them. Heavy armored cavalry was rare in any army, yet there were 40 of them in the capital. Ding Min had seen this kind of army on the border. The Li people called them the Roaring Plunder Army. The heavy armored soldiers had mounts. The light armored soldiers and archers also had mounts. They became light cavalry. When they marched, they came and went like the wind, cruel and merciless. They guarded the border all year round. Not only did they not think much of the border armies of other countries, but they would also plunder the Li merchant caravans if they were in a good mood. If they were in a good mood, they would probably even kill people. Right now they had killed a Li soldier in front of their eyes. If they became violent, it would be difficult to guarantee that they would start fighting. At that time, they would not be able to gain any advantage. The Li Dutu provoked again and again, but Ding Min remained calm and restrained. Thus, the Dutu seemed to feel bored. He frowned and snorted, Southern barbarians. What a spineless piece of trash. Then he said, I am the Dali Dutu Diwu Jing. Are you guys here to transport red clay? Where are you going? Hearing him say his name, Li Yunxin, who was standing to the side, looked at him a few more times. Diwu was a compound surname. In this world, almost all people with compound surnames had ancestors of the royal family. However, some of them were from hundreds of years ago, and some were from thousands of years ago. This surname was not common, but he had heard of it once in the city of Wei. It was the ghost emperor of the abandoned palace in the city of Wei. He was the general of the Jinwu guards under Lu Xungyang, the former Zhou emperor of Dai. At this time, the Qing soldier's neck was red with anger, but Ding Min's expression did not change. So you are the Diwu Dutu? These people are indeed going to Tongtianzhe to transport red earth, for the world's Xianmen, and for the welfare of the common people. I just heard this Yi soldier say that he encountered demons. Diwu Jing laughed disdainfully. Demons? We already killed them. Then he looked at the body of the Yi soldier. This coward. He was supposed to be our guide in the mountains, but he turned and ran when he saw demons. Deserters, no matter where they run, will die. You people are also deserters? Escaped from Redstone Gorge? Ding Min said in a low voice. We are not deserters. We are. At this point, the atmosphere had already relaxed a little. Thus, when Diwu Jing asked arrogantly, Ding Min answered neither humbly nor overbearingly, making the matter clear. Their Li army had entered the Yi kingdom from the eastern border. Because the world was working for the Xianmen, Yi Yu, and the Qing people were transporting red earth to Tongtianzhe, the Li army had to protect and escort. Diwu Jing's group was patrolling in the nearby mountains, with 3 Yi soldiers as their guide. Not only did they have secular soldiers, but they also had a Xianmen swordsman. They were lucky that they did not encounter any great fiendish demons with remarkable powers. Instead, they encountered small fries like the old fox demonis from before. It did not take much effort for the Xianmen swordsmen to deal with these demons, so the Li soldiers slowly lost their fear. Chapter 382. Just now, the sword cultivator did encounter a slightly more troublesome one. He claimed to be the chief of mountain patrol, Zhuanfeng, who was appointed by the great general of Yujun under the lord of Tongtian. It took the sword cultivator a lot of effort to kill him. When the 3 Yi soldiers saw the magical power of the demon, they were scared out of their wits. They felt that they couldn't win, so they turned and ran here. After taking care of the demon, the Li army gave chase. They caught up to him in the Qing army's camp, and shot him dead with 1 arrow. After explaining all of this, another person walked out from the Li army. This person's appearance was not extraordinary. In fact, it should be said that he was extremely ugly. He had a protruding mouth and monkey cheeks. A few thin strands of beard grew from the side of his lips, but it was yellow. His body was also short. He was shrunk into a green Taoist robe. He looked like a temple attendant who did odd jobs in a Taoist temple in the countryside. However, these arrogantly soldiers seemed to be extremely respectful towards him. They had originally looked at the Qing army with disdain. When he walked out, these tall soldiers lowered their eyes and automatically made a path for him. This was probably the swordsman Kong Tongzi, who had killed countless demons and had magical powers that Diwu Jing spoke of. This swordsman walked to Diwu Jing's side and swept his gaze down expressionlessly. He first saw Li Yunxin. He furrowed his brows slightly. His first impression was not good. This guy was very pretty. He didn't like him. Feeling slightly unhappy, the swordsman Kong Tongzi looked at the Qing soldiers again and said, "On the way here, did you see any demons?" Diwu Jing heard him ask this, and immediately laughed. "Taoist priest, you have asked too much. If these southern barbarians saw demons, they would have long died. Would they still be standing here? I think." Kong Tongzi turned his head and glanced at him. This strong man, who was a full 2 heads taller than Kong Tongzi, immediately stopped talking. He bowed slightly and smiled embarrassedly. "That's good. I spoke too much again." Kong Tongzi turned his face again to look at Ding Min. Ding Min glanced at Li Yunxin. Seeing that Taoist Hun Yuanzi was still leaning against the wall, ignoring them, he said, replying to Sendo, "I did encounter a demon." Diwu Jing was stunned by his words. Ding Min continued, "Last night, I met a fox demon. His brothers did not let him take advantage of them, and killed more than 10 of the beasts he commanded. Later on, the fox demon used her sorcery, and we couldn't defeat her. It's all thanks to this." As he spoke, he cupped his hands towards Li Yunxin and said, "Taoist Hun Yuanzi, we're safe because you killed the old fox." He did not say how Li Yunxin had killed the fox demon. Actually, he really wanted to say that, if he said that Taoist priest Hun Yuanzi could kill the enemy effortlessly, he would be able to boost his prestige when facing the Li army. He could tell from Li Yunxin's accent that he was a Qing man to the core. However, he was after all a meticulous, experienced, and prudent person. Thus, he felt that since these Sendo had different doors and all practiced Xianmen, then each of their methods would not be easily made public. It was just like how people on the Jiang who guarded their martial arts very strictly. He wasn't sure if he would accidentally reveal Taoist Hun Yuanzi's secret once he spoke of his methods, so he could only casually say it. After saying all this, he looked at Li Yunxin and found that the Taoist did not show any displeasure. He secretly felt that he had guessed correctly. Hearing his words, Kong Tongzi thought for a moment. Without looking at Li Yunxin, he only said to Ding Min, "What happened last night? Tell me in detail. Tell me about the demon." Ding Min then recounted all of the old fox's actions. When he was about to get to the part where Li Yunxin killed the enemy, and was hesitating about how to say it, Kong Tongzi waved his hand and said, "Forget it." Then he smiled and said, "So it's just a little demon that hasn't transformed into a human." After hearing Ding Min describe the old fox's methods, he knew its realm. This kind of demon, not to mention the people of Xianmen, even some unorthodox Taoists with high cultivation and extraordinary talents would be able to subdue them. Thus, he didn't want Ding Min to talk about Hun Yuanzi's magical powers. What kind of magical powers were needed to deal with this kind of little demon? For him, it was just a matter of summoning a flying sword in 2 or 3 moves. After laughing, he returned to his expressionless face and muttered to himself in a low voice, "General Honghua." He had been patrolling around the area with the E-Capital's Li army and killed many demons. Many of the little demons, in the Xianmen realm, were easily taken care of. Occasionally, he would meet an emptiness realm, but it wasn't difficult. Until today, he met a mountain patrol chief drilling wind. It was a yellow-furred lynx that was about to reach the peak of the emptiness realm. Thus, it took a lot of effort. And these demons all said that they were under the command of the General Honghua. Kong Tongzi was a Kenzo cultivator. It wasn't his idea to come out with the Li army. In fact, there were many low-level cultivators like him. They were all in small teams of about 100 people, and each had their own area. They were, in fact, the scouts of the alliance of Xianmen and mortals. The demons were spying on the Xianmen, and the Xianmen were spying on them. These days, he had gradually figured out the situation in the mountains. The most powerful demon in this vast area was probably this General Honghua. According to the description of the demon he killed, General Honghua's cultivation was not low. He should be in the transcendent state. His chances of winning against a transcendent state demon were very low, close to zero. Thus, he planned to go back and report everything, and ask the other martial brothers to make a decision. And it was said that General Honghua's superior was Yu Jun. He had heard of Yu Jun. He was a true state demon. He wouldn't be able to meet a demon king of this level. True state demons were all characters who ruled over an area. They were high up, and would never appear in the wilderness. Once they went out, they would be followed by a large number of demon soldiers and demon generals. Even a Xianmen sect would have to deal with them seriously. Thus, when Kong Tongzi thought of this, he turned to Di Wujing and said, "Let's stop here. Since these people are going to Tongtian Lake to transport the red soil, as a Xianmen cultivator, I have the responsibility to protect them. I will go with them and send them out of the Manwan Mountains." The people in the Li army had only heard of demons, but they had never seen one. These days, as Kong Tongzi killed many demons in the Manwan Mountains, he was no longer afraid. He even felt that it wasn't enough. Now that he heard that they were going to leave, he was very unhappy. But he couldn't disobey Kong Tongzi. Without this Taoist priest, it would be very difficult for them to deal with the demons. So Di Wujing frowned, looked at Ding Min and spat. These cowardly southern barbarians. He thought that this Taoist priest had to escort the red soil, so they had to leave. What he didn't know was that Kong Tongzi had already investigated the situation nearby, and felt that he had killed many low-level demons these days. If he didn't leave, then the General of Red Flame would personally come out, and he wouldn't be able to leave. The Li army was very unhappy, and the Qing army was also very unhappy. Although it would be much safer to have another cultivator with them, who would like the Li army's arrogance? Ding Min didn't answer, and tilted his head to look at Li Yunxin. Kong Tongzi saw the look in his eyes, and also turned his head. He saw Li Yunxin lazily bathing in the sun and slightly squinting at him. The autumn sun shone on his face. His face was very handsome, and his skin was as white as jade. She was tall and slender, with well-proportioned muscles. Her slender and powerful fingers were currently holding a water pouch, and playing with it. She had an otherworldly and elegant demeanor. When this sword cultivator saw this, he couldn't help but feel annoyed. He furrowed his brows slightly and said in a low voice, "Friend, which sect are you from?" Li Yunxin yawned and said, "I don't belong to any sect." Kong Tongzi raised his eyebrows and understood. "A painter?" Li Yunxin smiled. "Is that right?" The annoyance in Kong Tongzi's heart suddenly disappeared without a trace, and he felt much more open-minded. So, he was just a painter. It was not much different from what he had thought before. Naturally, he had also heard about the matter of the Qing general's heir, bringing a group of masters with him. But the so-called masters of the Qing kingdom were nothing more than painters and wild Taoists. Since this beautiful young man was an artist, how long could his beauty last? In another 10 years his face would age, and in another few decades, he would turn into a pile of yellow earth. These so-called painters and wild Taoists did not cultivate the great Xianmen path. They were just mortals who had some power that did not belong to them. And he was a cultivator of the Xianmen path. Their lifespans would lengthen because of cultivation. If they were lucky, they would live forever, and even become immortals. What was the use of arguing with this mortal? Thus, he turned his head, and no longer paid attention to Li Yunxin. He said to Ding Min in a low voice, "Come with us. Along the way, there's no need to worry about any monsters." After saying this, he waved his sleeve and disappeared into the forest. Di Wujing also glared at Ding Min and said in a rough voice, "You heard what I said. I'll give you 15 minutes to break camp." Thus 15 minutes later, these two groups of people with completely different backgrounds were on the road. The Li army was in front, and there were a number of horses accompanying them. Going down the mountain from here, the road was much smoother. Although they couldn't urge the horses to move, it was not a big problem for the war horses to walk. The Qing army was behind, escorting the Red Earth. Their pack horses were loaded and short-footed, so their speed was slower. The Li army was impatient and loudly scolded them. Some of the Qing army were angry, but they were all suppressed by Ding Min. After traveling like this for 2 hours, Yan couldn't take it anymore. He ran from the front of the group to the middle and followed Ding Min's horse. As he walked, he raised his face and asked, "What do we have to be angry about? We worked so hard to transport the Red Earth, and halfway there, we were robbed by the Li people. When we get there, they will take a share of the credit, and they will talk dirty along the way. Captain, are we afraid of them to this extent?" Ding Min listened to him with a straight face. She knew that these were the thoughts of the soldiers beside her. After thinking for a moment, she said in a low voice, "Yan Zi, when you go to the border and see these Li people, you will understand. Usually, they dare to slaughter their own villages on the border of the Li kingdom and kill innocent people to take credit. Not to mention in this war, these people are the howling raiding army. Rather than an army, they are more like armed bandits. If there is a real conflict, do you want your brothers to lose a few more lives in this endless mountain, just because of a moment of anger?" Speaking to this point, he lowered his head and looked at Yan. Chapter 383. When Yan heard this, he opened his mouth, but did not know what to say. He was a young man who was impulsive and aggressive, but he wasn't stupid. When he heard Ding Min mention the howling raiding army, he knew that it was one of the strongest and most powerful troops in the world. They had more people and were more imposing. Even so, he was still angry and kicked the ground as he walked. "I don't like that Taoist priest either. He's shifty-eyed." This voice was echoed by many people, but they only lowered their voices and whispered to each other. They couldn't find trouble with the Li army or the swordsmen, so this was the only way to vent their anger, but they didn't dare to say it out loud. It was really suffocating. Ding Min and Su Mao exchanged glances. Their morale was raised. At first, they were scared when they met the demons. Then Taoist Hun Yuanzi calmed them down. Then they met the Li people. They found that these arrogant Li people didn't care about the demons and looked down on them. So the soldiers were motivated. With this motivation, they became more courageous. At this moment, the fear in his heart had completely vanished. Ding Min sighed in his heart. It's okay to be angry. He finally brought these children out of Manwan Mountain. Then, he turned to look at Li Yunxin. He found that Li Yunxin's face was still calm. He was riding a dwarf horse and walking with the troops. He was either resting with his eyes closed or enjoying the scenery. He was arrogant when he appeared last night, and he didn't seem to care about anyone now. He didn't want to talk to these soldiers. Ding Min couldn't help but compare. This Taoist Hun Yuanzi, or that swordsman Kong Tongzi, who was stronger, because he saved his life last night, and what he said about politics in the camp. Ding Min hoped that this Taoist Hun Yuanzi was stronger. But he heard Li Yunxin call himself a painter. He knew about painters. In the secular world, famous painters had a higher status than unorthodox Taoists. This unruly Taoist did not only refer to those Taoist priests who roamed the Jianghu without a place to rely on, but also included those Taoist priests who had Taoist temples and were under the orders of the imperial court. These Taoist priests did not belong to the 36 paradises or the 72 sections. Thus, they were commonly referred to as wild Taoist priests. However, compared to the Taoist priests or cultivators of the grotto heavens and sects, the identity of an artist was not worth mentioning. Ding Min felt that this Taoist priest Primordial Chaos was a great artist. But no matter how powerful they were, they couldn't be compared to the people of the grotto heaven sect. It was said that the emperor had once wanted to meet a female Taoist from the grotto heaven, but the female Taoist completely ignored him. The emperor did not even dare to get angry. Kong Tongzi had spoken rudely to him, but Taoist master Hun Yuanzi didn't retort. Ding Min felt that perhaps this proud Taoist master of theirs was weak in front of cultivators. Actually, when he thought about it, he also felt suffocated. Thus, He pulled on the reins slightly and had the warhorse beneath him slow down. He wanted to get closer to Taoist Master Hun Yuanzi and talk to him. For example, what did this Taoist master think of the Li army? Should they follow all the way, or fight to find another path on their own? At this moment he suddenly heard an order come from the front, telling them to stop. Their group of 140 people snaked along the mountain path like a long snake. The order from the front took a long time to arrive. When Ding Min heard the order, he thought about it, and turned his horse onto a small hill by the side of the road to look forward. He found that the Li army at the very front was talking to some other soldiers. Right now they were going downhill. The group at the front had turned a corner, so there were a few trees with golden leaves covering them. He could not see clearly. He asked the people at the front what had happened. The order came slowly. The Qing army at the very front didn't know. They only knew that they seemed to have encountered another army in the forest, and were asking about their background and purpose. Ding Min narrowed his eyes and looked for a while. However, the people at the front at the foot of the mountain were only the length of a finger. They were 200 meters away, and couldn't be seen clearly. He was a soldier, and wasn't used to waiting blankly. He turned his head and said, "Yen go ahead and see what happened." Yen received the order, and immediately jumped onto the grassy slope beside the mountain path. He jogged over, kicking up a trail of dust under the sunlight. However, it only took half an incense stick's time before it returned. His neck was flushed red, and his face was full of indignation. When he reached Ding Min's horse he cursed, "F***ck, these northern bearded men are too much." But he also knew the importance of the matter. After cursing, he immediately said, "They stopped me from coming back when I was far away. They didn't say anything, and just chased me away. Captain, are these northern bearded men going to defame us?" Ding Min furrowed his brows and looked forward. He lowered his head and asked, "Did you see who they were?" Yen panted heavily. "I don't know where they are from, but from a distance, their armor was clear and they were very big, even bigger than the northern bearded men. I only got a rough look, but I can't tell where they are from." Ding Min was slightly stunned. "You can't tell either?" Yen was brought by Su Mao. Although he was young, he had seen a lot. From the south to the north of the Qing kingdom, he had seen all kinds of military camps in the past 5 years. He was also trained as an elite scout, so he was very knowledgeable. But now that he said this, it meant that the army that appeared in front of them was completely unfamiliar to him. He couldn't even guess the possibility of who they were. In the mountains, there were people from the Qing kingdom, Yi kingdom, Yu kingdom, Li kingdom, Chen kingdom, and Lai kingdom. Yen said he couldn't tell which army they were from. Ding Min looked at Su Mao. The two of them thought for a while. Ding Min said, "I'll go and take a look." He was an old soldier, and naturally didn't like situations that were out of his control. The feeling of not knowing anything was the most worrisome thing. Su Mao nodded. "Yen you go with him." At this moment Li Yunxin, who had been silent all the way, said, "Don't go if you don't want to die." His voice was still the same, lazy, slow, and a little cynical, as if he was playing a game. Ding Min might have been unhappy with what he said last night, but now he said it, and Ding Min was stunned. He suddenly turned his head. "Master Taoist, what do you mean?" Li Yunxin smiled. "Let's wait and see." Diwu Jing, the commandant of the Li Kingdom's roaring army, was a big man. He was tall and strong, had a bad temper, and was ready to curse when he opened his mouth. But he was actually very careful. If he wasn't careful, he wouldn't have been able to become a centurion. So, when this army walked out of the forest, he frowned. If it was the Qing kingdom's roaring army, Yi kingdom's army, or Yu kingdom's army, if he was in a good mood, he would first look at them coldly, and then ask their officers to come out and talk to him. He was the commandant of the Li kingdom's roaring army. Even a commander in those armies had to talk to him politely, not to mention a squad leader or squad leader. But this group, he had never seen them before. Their vanguard turned around this small hill, and suddenly ran into two big men, standing straight in the middle of the road. They were all strong, with backs of tigers and waists of bears. They wore heavy-horned helmets. The helmets were dark red, decorated with tall pheasant feathers, and looked very gorgeous. They wore colorful armor, Not leather armor, but iron armor. Bright iron scales were embedded on the dark red thick skin, and colorful python leather belts were tied around their waists. They wore black boots with clouds on their feet. These two big men held heavy iron spears in their hands, blocking the road like door gods. They didn't panic when they saw the Li Kingdom's army. They only shouted in a low voice, "Our general has ordered that anyone who passes through this place must dismount and wait for investigation." The gorgeous armor they wore seemed to be ceremonial armor. But Diwu Jing saw a lot of knife and axe marks on it, and also saw black blood stains between the gaps. This meant that the owner of the armor really wore it to fight. Seeing the gap on the heavy iron spear, he knew it must have been a very fierce battle. To be able to use this kind of heavy iron spear, it would not be a spearhead that looked like silver. His roaring army was famous in the world. Why didn't he know there was such a strong army? Which great general was it that was so arrogant as to show off his might, and show off his ostentatiousness in the mountains? So he sent someone to ask. As a result, the two big men only said this one sentence, and didn't say anything else. Diwu Jing was unhappy, and was about to go forward himself. But he saw dozens of strong men, wearing the same colorful armor coming out of the forest. He was so shocked that he stopped the horse. How could he not know? The armor on the big man was enough to exchange for the armor of all of them. Now these dozens of burly men were dressed like this. Could it be that the Grand Marshal of the armed forces had arrived? He was a soldier, so he knew his limits and restrained his temper. But Kong Tongzi was an outsider. He was already afraid of the demons in the mountains looking for trouble, and was in a hurry to leave. Now he suddenly saw some idiot from some family putting on a show of power here. He had long become impatient. Squeezing his legs, he urged his horse forward. He raised his hand and pointed at the strong man in colorful armor and shouted, "Who is your general? Call him out to see me. Do you mortals think that you can block the arrival of my sword sex Wuyu sword faction's Kong Tongzi?" At this time, someone reported from behind that a spy from the Qing army had come to ask what was going on. Speaking of the Qing army, Kong Tongzi thought of the handsome painter. So he didn't turn his head and only shouted, "Tell him to get back." Then he looked at the strong man. "Are you deaf?" At this time, the sound of a horn and the rumbling of drums suddenly rang out in the dense forest. Then the trees on the side of the road swayed. Countless birds flew up from the forest. It seemed that a large army had arrived. Hearing this formation, Diwu Jing was so anxious he was about to break out in a sweat. Although the howling lashing army was a strong army, they came and went like the wind. Now some unknown general had made such a ruckus. Did he not know that the thousands of people from the Qing kingdom had all been destroyed in Redstone Gorge? Then two groups of black-helmeted and black-armored knife and shield bearers surged out of the forest and formed a line in front of them. Then, two rows of golden-helmeted and golden-armored double-axe-men opened the way and formed a line behind them. Then, surrounded by many colorful armored soldiers, a general wearing a bright red battle robe and riding a white horse slowly walked out of the forest. Diwu Jing, Kong Tongzi, and the people of the Li army all froze when they saw this general. ***** Note. Silver like a wax spearhead, not a silver like wax spearhead. Yes, lead and tin alloy, not wax. Too many idioms and words have had to compromise with the public and change their original meaning to the wrong meaning, because they have been misused on a large scale, for a long time, and because of widespread misuse. For example, wind from an empty cave. It originally meant the matter has a basis. Behind each idiom and word is a story that has been passed down for thousands of years. It is almost a microcosm of a certain period of history. Chinese is a language with a story and a life. I really don't want many years from now, when our descendants speak a word, to think about what the original wish was, what the meaning is now, because it has been misused by others. So within the limits of my ability, I will mark out the words that are easy to make mistakes. If I have used them incorrectly, I hope everyone can point them out. I am really a good writer. Chapter 384. Because it was a female general, the people of the Li Kingdom were tough, and the status of men and women was more equal than that of the southern countries. It was not uncommon to see women as officials, and there was even a light eyebrow battalion in the army. But even so, they had never seen a woman as a general. Although the military system of each country was different, the general was definitely a military officer of the upper three ranks, and they had never heard of a woman holding this position. But the one in front of them, as a woman, she was not very beautiful. Although she had red lips and white teeth, she had a pair of thick eyebrows and big eyes. Her face was slightly square, and her nose was high. If she was a man, she would be considered handsome, but if she was a woman, she would seem rough. The armor of the previous spear-wielding warriors was gorgeous, but the armor of this general was even more gorgeous. The leather helmet on her head was surrounded by a large group of feathers, and 2 of them were especially long, more than 10 feet long. As the horse moved, the 2 feathers fluttered, looking very imposing. The armor covering her body was also a chainmail, but the edges of the collar, gauntlets, and skirt were covered with thick fur, making her look imposing and mighty. Right now, her face, which was hidden in a large group of feathers, fur, and armor, was expressionless. Surrounded by a group of bodyguards, she slowly rode out of the forest and stopped in the middle of the path. She looked at Diwu Jing condescendingly, and then looked at Kong Tongzi. After pondering for a while, she said, "Wuji sword sect? Humph. Is it that great?" After saying this, she raised her hand and pointed at Diwu Jing with the horsewhip in her hand. "Which country's soldier are you from?" When this general heard about Wuji sword sect, her words were full of disdain. Diwu Jing was not sure where she came from. He was not sure. Kong Tongzi also frowned. He was not one of those secluded cultivators, and he also knew some of the ways of the world. So when he heard her words, he was stunned for a while, and temporarily suppressed the anger in his heart. "I am the Dutu of the Li Kingdom's raiding army. Under the order of General Ji, I will accompany Kong Tongzi and Sendo to enter Manwan Mountain to protect and eliminate the demon." Diwu Jing frowned slightly and said in a deep voice, "May I ask who you are, General?" When the general heard his words, he sneered. "Oh, eliminate the demon? You guys can also kill demons?" After saying this, he raised his chin as if he was waiting to hear a joke. Then he pointed at Diwu Jing with his horsewhip. "Tell me, what kind of demon did you kill?" Diwu Jing took a deep breath, reporting to the great general, "We are mortals. Naturally, it is difficult for us to slay demons. But this Sendo Kong Tongzi is a Kenzo expert. We're just here to cheer for him." If we're talking about slaying demons, it's all thanks to this Sendo. Seeing that this great general's words were not kind, Diwu Jing did not want to get into trouble. But just because she didn't want to get into trouble didn't mean that she could tolerate the other party's imposing manner. In that case, she could go and find Kong Tongzi. As a mortal, he had to bow his head to the emperor, but that Sendo did not fall for it. However, who was this female general? The female general heard Diwu Jing's words and turned to look at Kong Tongzi. "You? How can someone like him be called Sendo? You have a protruding mouth and monkey-like cheeks. I think you look like a demon. Tell me, what kind of demon did you get rid of?" Kong Tongzi was born ugly, and it was a taboo for others to mention it. When he saw Li Yunxin before, he could comfort himself by saying that the kid was just a painter and would turn into a pile of dirt after a few decades. But now, when he saw the appearance of this great general, he could no longer restrain himself. He frowned and said sternly, "You mortal, how dare you? I didn't argue with you because you have armor. But don't you know your own identity? Slaying demons? All the big and small demons in this mountain were killed by I. Why do you think you can put on a show here and not be taken away by the demons?" The female general was not angry. She sneered again and her eyes became sharp. "Good. So, the land that I personally conferred here, and the red-robed old immortal were also killed by you." As soon as she said this, it was like a thunderbolt on a sunny day, exploding in Kong Tongzi's mind. Before he could speak, the female general frowned again and shouted sternly, "Stupid thief! Open your dog eyes and see who I am." As soon as she finished speaking, the soldiers behind her immediately took out 2 big flags. On the left side, on a golden background, was written in big ink characters, "You King's Ladies Wa." On the right side, on a crimson background, was also written in big ink characters. Red Flame General. Red Flame General. How could Kong Tongzi not be familiar with this name? These days, he had killed many small demons in the mountain, and it was said that they were all under the command of the Red Flame General. And the reason why he had to escort the Qing army out of the mountain was because he was worried that the Red Flame General would be angry and find him. He did not think that he would run into her today. After all, his cultivation was not high, and he rarely saw big demons. The ones he came into contact with were only small demons. And those small demons either did not have a human form, or had strange temperaments. With just one look, he could tell that they were not human. The Xianmen did not have good things to say about demons. They only said that they were cruel, cunning, and tyrannical. Thus, when Kong Tongzi first saw the Red Flame General, he saw that her subordinates looked like humans, and she also looked like a human. Her words and actions were more like that of a normal mortal army, so he did not think anything else. On the other hand, Li Yunxin had long known that the more brilliant a demon was, the more he was no different from a human, and had seen more. Thus, when he saw the colorful armored soldiers appear, he knew that they were not human. Kong Tongzi came to a realization, and so did Di Wujing. For a moment, they were stunned on the spot. In the hearts of mortals like him, big demons were all green-faced and ferocious-looking. Who knew that they were more like humans? It was in this moment of shock that the Red Flame General snorted coldly. Since you have admitted your crime, then accept your punishment. You killed 12 of my generals. Today, I will poke 12 holes in your body. If you can survive, humph. As soon as she finished speaking, a black heavy iron spear appeared in her palm out of thin air. She stabbed it towards the front of the Li army. At the foot of the hill, a cloud of dust exploded. Immediately, more than a dozen Li soldiers were shrouded in it. They could not see their figures. Ding Min and the others were far away, more than 100 meters away. So they saw that the person who looked like a general was talking with Kong Tongzi and Di Wujing. But after 3 or 4 sentences, the general suddenly got angry. With a wave of her arm, she took out a long spear from somewhere and threw it forward. In the cloud of dust, flesh and blood immediately flew everywhere. At such a distance, it was difficult for them to feel the power of that blow. But they could clearly see that the trees on both sides of the path, which were as thick as the mouth of a bowl, were blown by the rushing airflow in all directions. Then, with a series of cracking sounds, they were all broken. The stones that flew up were like countless hidden weapons, whizzing randomly through the air. The unlucky ones in the Li army, who were slightly closer, were hit in the face and eyes by these stones and broken bones, and immediately died. Everything happened in an instant. 2 breaths ago, Ding Min was still asking Li Yunxin, "What did the Taoists say?" 2 breaths later, this army of over 100 people was suddenly attacked. Ding Min didn't have time to sigh at how accurately Yunxin's words, "If you don't want to die, don't go." She only abruptly jumped off her horse and shouted in a stern voice, "Prepare for battle! Prepare for battle!" At this moment, the Qing army and Li army both knew they had been attacked. The path was narrow. The colorful armored warriors had already formed 2 lines of formation, and were waiting for the exhausted, but they were still marching. There were hills and forests on both sides, making it difficult for them to spread out. Even though there were a number of archers in the group, the dust from the attack just now had yet to disperse. Their Duta's life and death were still unknown. How could they shoot randomly? For a moment, the people on the rugged path were thrown off their horses, and a chaotic mess. Some ran to the sides, wanting to take the high ground and shoot. Some yelled for sword and shield soldiers to go save their Dutu. There were also some who looked back, suspecting that the Qing army was behind this. On the contrary, Ding Min's group had heard Li Yunxin's words ahead of time, and were much calmer. In a moment, they finished forming their formation. When they looked at Taoist priest Hun Yuanzi again, they were all stunned. The 100-man army was in chaos, but this Taoist was sitting steadily on the back of a short horse, and standing on a small hill by the side of the road. As he narrowed his eyes and looked ahead with interest, he pulled open the cork of the wine bag Ding Min had given him, and took small sips of the wine. It was as if what was ahead was not a battle to the death, but a performance. When Ding Min saw the attack just now, he knew that it was not something a human could do. Perhaps they had encountered a demon again. He wasn't proficient in dealing with demons. Thus, he could only listen to Taoist priest Hun Yuanzi's opinion. But now, seeing this Taoist's actions, although it made them feel much calmer, but, he shouted in a low voice inside the formation, "Taoist! What do we do now? Should we kill our way up?" He didn't like the way the Li army did things. But if they ran away now, they would be beheaded if people found out about it in the future. If the demon killed all the Li people, it would definitely catch up. They would die either way, so it was better to fight with all their strength. Taoist priest Hun Yuanzi smiled and said, "Go up? Go up for what? To die." Then he raised his hand, and in the midst of the chaotic army, he lightly pointed at the two raised flags. He said unhurriedly, "Look. Prince Yu's madam's was arrow, an arrow. Red Flame General's arrow, an arrow. But everyone is dressed like a chicken feather. What do you think this Red Flame General's true identity is?" It was at this moment that lightning crackled from within the cloud of dust. A flying sword rushed out with a buzzing sound, circled twice in the air, and then fiercely stabbed down. They also heard Kong Tongzi's voice. "Demon! Eat my sword!" The Li soldiers had been with Kong Tongzi for a long time, so they all knew this was his voice and his method. Their morale was immediately boosted. Then they heard Diwu Jing's voice again. "Formation! Formation! Archers on both sides spread out and shoot." As soon as he finished speaking, the warriors in colorful armor with spears shouted and pressed forward together. Li Jun's heart calmed down. Finally there was a method, and he pushed it forward. At this time, Li Yunxin turned to look at Ding Min and said, "Can't guess." Chapter 385. How could Ding Min be in the mood to guess this riddle? She said hurriedly, "Priest, if it's a demon, how can we just stand here and watch?" Li Yunxin huffed, "Idiot. Arrow ho. Isn't it just a pheasant? This General Honghua's real body must be a wild chicken. Ha ha ha." Then, his expression changed, and he looked at Ding Min. She has a dozen demon generals under her command. Some of them in the realm of wills and emptiness. She looks like a proper person, and has a grand entrance. She is at least in the realm of transformation. And look at her demon power. She is at the peak of the realm of transformation. A demon at the peak of the realm of transformation can be considered a small demon king. Kong Tongzi's cultivation is limited, and he doesn't have any powerful magical treasures. Right now he is fighting in close combat. I think he will be sent flying in 3 breaths. What are you going up for? Ding Min didn't understand what he said about wills, transcendent, and peak of the realm of transformation. But she knew that he was referring to a demon in front of them, and a powerful one at that. Kong Tongzi could not defeat that guy. Hearing these words, Ding Min and the Qing soldiers were shocked. This Taoist priest Hun Yuanzi, was his cultivation even higher than that Kinzo Sendo? They were all martial artists and knew that only when one's martial arts reached a certain level could one see the depth of another person. But this Taoist priest Hun Yuanzi was calm and could explain the situation in front of them. Could it really be? Just as they were thinking of this, there was another rumble in front of them. It shook the ground under their feet 3 times. They saw a figure fly out from the cloud of dust and fog and crash into a small hill to the side. Immediately half of the hill collapsed. They had never seen a scene like this before. For a moment they were all stunned. Suddenly, the dust on the hill dissipated. It was as Li Yunxin said. It was Kong Tongzi who had been sent flying. Previously, this sword cultivator had been arrogant and insufferably arrogant. Now, his nose was bruised and his face was swollen. Even the Taoist bun on his head was a mess. Beside him, a misty green flying sword swayed and flew around him, as if it was protecting its master. But the sword was also flying crookedly, as if it would fall at any time. He took 2 deep breaths and seemed to be in a daze. He then saw the Red Flame General riding his horse out from the dust cloud. The swordsman was in a sorry state, and General Red Flame seemed to have suffered a loss. One of the 2 long feathers on top of his head had been broken, and the colorful armor on his left arm had also been pierced. The scales of the armor hung down like a chain. The horse took 2 or 3 steps and stopped. The demon stared at Kong Tongzi. Fine. You do have some skills, you were even able to injure me. He then turned around to look at the Li army, who were currently fighting against the warriors in colorful armor. However, the Howling Lu army was a strong army after all. Even though the warriors in colorful armor were not human, and each of them had the strength of a calf, the Howling Lu army advanced and retreated methodically. With the help of the long-range archers, they managed to hold their ground and did not collapse. Only 10 of them died, and more than 10 were injured. Seeing this scene, General Hong Ho frowned and shouted, "Trash! How did this general train you normally? You still can't take him down." Although she looked like a woman, her words did not have the slightest hint of a woman's weakness. After saying these words, she turned around and shouted, "You guys go!" She was referring to the soldiers in black helmets and black armor. Previously, when the colorful armor warriors went up, the black-armored warriors and the gold-armored warriors she brought did not attack. It was as if she treated the Howling Lu army as opponents to train her own soldiers, and let them fight round after round for fun. After giving the order, she turned around and looked at Kong Tongzi. "This general has only pierced 1 hole in your body. There are still 11 holes left. You have to bear with it. If you don't survive 12 holes and dare to die, you see how this general will refine your soul." Seeing all this, Ding Min could not bear it anymore. He stared at Li Yunxin. "Taoist priest, if you don't help, Sendo won't live. They won't live." Li Yunxin frowned and looked at him. "What does it have to do with me whether he can live or not?" Ding Min was stunned, as if she did not expect Li Yunxin to say this. "Taoist priest, you saved us last night. Taoist priest Kong Tongzi is also a human. No matter how dirty he is, we are here to fight against the demons together." Li Yunxin pursed her lips and reached out to slowly remove a fallen leaf from her sleeve. "Have you forgotten? That bastard was rude to me just now. His nose was pointed to the sky. Now you want me to bury the hatchet and save him? Do I look like someone easy to bully?" When he said these words, all the soldiers beside Ding Min could hear him. At this moment, Yan Er could not bear it anymore and shouted, "Why are you so?" Before he could finish, Su Mao covered his mouth and scolded him in a low voice. "What are you saying?" Li Yunxin was not angry. Instead, he laughed and said, "That's right. I am a petty and vengeful person. What can you do about it?" When he said this, these people really did not know what to say. Normally, an expert like Taoist priest Han Yuanzi should cherish his reputation and be righteous. At least it seemed. But now, he was like this. Ding Min did not know how to describe it, and they could not say anything. Therefore, Ding Min gritted her teeth and suddenly cupped her fists toward Li Yunxin. "Taoist priest, thank you for saving my life last night. If we met the Li army on the battlefield, and they were enemies, I, Ding Min, would not be merciful no matter who killed them. But now, since the world is fighting against the demons together, I can't just watch the demons kill without doing anything. Farewell." After saying this, he laughed and shouted, "Abandon the food and water and move forward. Break through from the left." In reality, this order contained the will to die. Li Yunxin quietly made a ha sound. He watched as the 40 Qing soldiers, who had been terrified 4 hours ago, actually break through from his side without looking sideways. He knew that perhaps this was, there are things to be done and things not to be done. For example, when they faced the demons alone, they would be afraid and terrified and want to live. But now, their allies were fighting in front of them, and they had no way to escape. That was not called escaping. It was called abandoning the formation. However, he did not expect to see such a thing happen to these small soldiers. Thus Li Yunxin narrowed his eyes and felt, mixing with these people, he had finally seen something interesting. In this world, there was nothing more interesting than people, or the hearts of people. Even so, he smiled and said, "Fine." At this moment, General Hong Ho raised his spear and thrust it toward Kong Tongzi. Seeing Kong Tongzi on his last breath, the flying sword by his side almost fell to his feet. General Hong Ho's heavy spear pierced through the air, heading straight for his left waist. It seemed like she wanted to destroy his snow mountain, and Qi Si first, and then slowly stabbed the remaining 10 times. But at this moment, Kong Tongzi's eyes suddenly lit up. He reached out and grabbed General Honghua's spear. Although demons were known for their strong bodies, but a cultivator's body was not something a normal person could compare to. Earlier, he had shown weakness to lure the enemy. Now he had suddenly stopped this witch's weapon. General Honghua was stunned. Taking advantage of this moment, the flying sword by his side suddenly flew up like a poisonous snake raising its head. It turned into a bolt of lightning and stabbed toward the witch's face. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. The mortals could barely see the general process of what happened. They knew that this was the Kinzo cultivator's plan to deliberately show weakness and lure the enemy. Now they had finally counterattacked. But what Li Yunxin saw was not optimistic at all. He saw that when Kong Tongzi grabbed the witch's spear, a cold smile appeared on the corner of the witch's lips. The meaning of this smile could not be more obvious. The witch had long anticipated that the swordsman would make such a move. Even when the flying sword stabbed toward the witch's face, her smile did not fade. In this instant, a golden mask popped out from the helmet and blocked the flying sword's path. It turned out that this demoness was already prepared and was just playing with Kong Tongzi. Li Yunxin clearly saw all of this. He then looked at the Qing soldiers who had the will to die and were throwing themselves at the demon soldiers. After this thought spun around in his head, he sighed and said, "I don't know what kind of virtue you have accumulated in your last life." Then, he gently flicked his pinky. Thus, a trace of the insignificant but extremely terrifying demon power, belonging to a true state great demon, instantly attached itself to Kong Tongzi's flying sword. Then, the flying sword struck General Honghua's golden mask. With a loud bang, General Honghua and her horse were forced back a dozen steps. Half of the helmet on her head was blown into dust, and the lower half of her face was torn apart, revealing bloody eyes, fascia, and even brain matter. But this demon's physical body was strong after all. She had not died after receiving such a heavy injury, and didn't even fall off her horse. However, she was still shocked by the power of this strike. She should have easily blocked this strike, and then played with the swordsman. General Honghua's arrogance disappeared because of this sword. She sat on the horse in a daze for a while, staring at the equally dazed Kong Tongzi. Then with a scream, she turned her horse and ran away, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake as she fled into the forest. Once the general left, the demon soldiers that she had abandoned seemed to have lost their souls. They all stood where they were like wooden puppets in an instant. In this daze, a few of them were immediately cut down by the Li army. After another 2 breaths, the Li army and the Qing army finally realized that this wretched-looking swordsman had really beaten back the female demon. For a moment their morale was greatly boosted. They changed from defense to offense, and like a swarm of bees, they killed their way into the enemy group. But just as they raised their weapons, they saw a flash of green light in front of them. The colorful armored, black-armored, and golden-armored warriors all disappeared. On the contrary, a nest of colorful golden pheasants suddenly appeared in the forest, flapping their wings and flying away in a disorderly manner. Then they saw dozens of black-armored tortoises in the withered grass on the ground. They were squeezed together and didn't know what to do. Then, they saw a group of golden-armored beetles buzzing and dancing in the air. Not long after, they also disappeared. They were all transformed from these birds, tortoises, and insects. Chapter 386. If this had happened in a legendary novel, it would have been interesting and amazing. But it had appeared on the battlefield. There were still the corpses of their comrades in the grassland. The uneasiness of the crowd filled the air. No one had the mind to think about such an interesting thing. After a moment of shock, the soldiers of the Li army knew that this was the demon's camouflage technique. They didn't need anyone to give the order. They raised the knives at their waists and hacked wildly at the black tortoises. However, the shells of these old tortoises were hard and could not be cut open by normal knives and swords. Thus, they flipped them over and stabbed them into the sockets of their necks, stirring them with force. These big tortoises also bled red blood. For a moment, the smell of blood filled the air in the forest. It was as if another big battle had been fought. After dealing with them, the commander of the Li army, Di Wujing, suddenly turned his head and looked behind him. At this moment, the armor on his body had cracked open. His hair was a mess. His mouth and nose were full of blood. There was a slanted knife wound on his neck, curling up the flesh. A personal guard beside him saw this, and hurried over to help him take off his armor and treat the wound. Diwu Jing pushed him aside and reached out to tear off the broken armor. Then he strode through the wounded soldiers and pulled out a knife stuck diagonally on the ground. He came to the front of the Qing army. His appearance and aura were indeed terrifying. Blood was still flowing from the wound on his neck, soaking through half of his body. His face was also black and red like a demon. The shields in front of the Qing army had yet to be removed. Diwu Jing's face was dark. Without a word, he extended his foot and kicked. His huge physique was strong to begin with, and his kick was skillful as well. As a result, he was able to kick away the two shields with just one kick. Then it was as if he saw the Qing army as nothing. He pushed left and right as if he was in his own army. He opened up a path for himself and walked in front of Ding Min. The Qing soldiers already felt slightly apologetic for coming late. Seeing that Diwu Jing was seriously injured again, they thought that he had barged in so angrily to reason with their team leader. Facing a seriously injured soldier who had just won a battle, they couldn't really capture him. There were still twice as many Li Jun soldiers over there. However, Diwu Jing was not here to reason. Ding Min frowned slightly. "Fifth General." With only these 4 words, Fifth Jing raised his saber and chopped down. Although he was injured, this saber strike was powerful and heavy, actually producing a sound of breaking air. Who would have thought that Diwu Jing would run into the Qing army to kill people? They were all stunned for a moment. Ding Min was stunned as well. Yan Er, on the other hand, was smart enough to block the attack with his longbow, but it was only slightly off the mark. It was originally aimed at the face, but now it was aimed at the shoulder. However, Ding Min had already come back to her senses. She crossed her arms and used the armor on her arms to block the attack. With a clanging sound, Ding Min and her horse were forced back 3 steps. The armor on her arm was cut into 3 pieces, and half of her body was numb. Now they knew that Diwu Jing was really going to kill someone. The officers and soldiers on both sides immediately swarmed him. Some grabbed his waist, some grabbed his arms, some grabbed his legs, and they pressed him to the ground. They didn't dare to kill him. They were afraid that they would strangle the heavily injured Li commander to death. On this side, the Qing army had moved. On the other side, the Li army was also in a mess. Holding weapons in their hands, they surrounded the Qing army and chaotically shouted things like, "The southern barbarians ran away at the last minute and still want to harm our governor." The Qing army had nothing to shout back at. They could only form a formation and face them silently with ashen faces. Inside the formation, since Diwu Jing was pressed to the ground, Ding Min jumped off her horse and called for the Qing army to pull Diwu Jing up. After such a torment, the Li commander finally had no strength. But his gaze was still fierce. He only looked at Ding Min, as if the one being captured was not him. "Watch the battle, Do you southern barbarians know how the Li dynasty deals with deserters and those who are afraid to fight?" "We are not Li people," Ding Min said calmly. At the same time, she accepted the sackcloth Su Mao handed over. As she stared at Diwu Jing, she slowly wrapped the wound on her arm. "Furthermore, we are not watching the battle, nor are we afraid to fight. General Diwu is skilled in the art of war and strategy. Think about it." As he slowly spoke, he glanced at the hillside not far away amidst the flashes of knives and swords around him. Li Yunxin was looking at the scenery. "We were attacked on the road. In reality, we were ambushed. Since the other side came prepared and could set up an ambush in front, it is hard to guarantee that they wouldn't set up an ambush in the back. Although we are 2 armies, we are fighting together for the righteous path of the world against demons. How could we sit back and do nothing?" Ding Min said in a low voice. "Earlier, we were only holding the formation to prevent being attacked from the front and back, and being attacked from the front and back. Later, we saw that the enemy was not doing so, so we also pressed forward. General Diwu is a clear-eyed person. There is no way you couldn't see it clearly." Diwu Jing smiled coldly. "Holding the formation? I think you want to run away. Let me ask you, There's no need to ask. His words were interrupted. Kong Tongzi held his sword in his hand and leaned on the ground as he walked into the middle of the chaotic soldiers. The Li army and the Qing army were facing off earlier. Their knives and spears were unsheathed. It seemed that with just one look, they would start fighting. Now that Kong Tongzi had walked over, no one dared to point their swords at him. They all lowered their weapons. He cut a sorry figure and walked majestically until he was between Diwu Jing and Ding Min. He looked at the two of them. Then he said to Diwu Jing, "Don't you see what that painter Hun Yuanzi is doing? It is rare for these people to have such courage." He huffed and turned his head to look at Li Yunxin. His gaze was complicated. Logically speaking, it was true that the Qing army had delayed the battle. It was also true that the painter Hun Yuanzi was afraid to advance. However, he looked at Li Yunxin's expression and behavior. If he had indeed ordered the Qing army not to fight and was going to watch them die, then now that he saw them safe and sound, where did he find the courage to be so calm? Furthermore, just now, he knew he was going to die. He saw General Honghua's gaze at that moment. He also knew that his strike did not have such great power. Yet that demon was heavily injured. He knew that it was not his own power. There was a master in the dark. Afterward, Kong Tongzi laughed involuntarily in his heart, laughing at himself. He had truly been scared by that demon. For a moment, he even wondered if this primordial chaos master was that expert. Because of this thought, he looked at Ding Min again. "I want to ask you. Answer me honestly. Just now, what was Hun Yuanzi doing?" Ding Min froze slightly. Then he furrowed his brows slightly. "Priest Hun Yuanzi, just now, he was following us to cover our retreat." Kong Tongzi saw Ding Min's expression when he said these words. He also saw the expressions of the Qing soldiers beside him. Thus, he knew that he seemed to be speaking against his heart. Thus, he temporarily relaxed on Hun Yuanzi's side. It wasn't him. He was just a painter who was afraid of death and didn't want others to charge and kill him. Chapter 387. But if it wasn't Hun Yuanzi, who else could it be? Kong Tongzi frowned between the Li army and the Qing army. He frowned for a dozen breaths. Then, he suddenly made a sword sign in his hand and slowly rose into the air. His method was considered a small trick among cultivators. But in the eyes of these mortals, it was a real power that surpassed their understanding. For a moment, these soldiers held their breath and stared at him. They almost forgot about the dispute earlier. A swordsman who had just defeated a strong enemy showed such skill. Who wouldn't be convinced? But when Kong Tongzi was in the air, he suddenly stopped and bowed. He said in a clear voice, "Thank you, my friend." Then he bowed 3 times respectfully. At this time, even the slowest soldier knew that someone had helped him just now. In fact, Kong Tongzi was not surprised. There were many people in the same way in the mountains. It was rare to see them. But if they met a passing master, they helped him, and then left with the wind. It was not something to be surprised about. But that little painter Hun Yuanzi was really hateful. He paid his respects to the expert in the air and flew straight to Li Yunxin's side. Only cultivators of the transcendent state could fly in the air. Kong Tongzi was a transcendent cultivator. Although the sky dance technique had yet to reach maturity and could not fly too far, it was enough to show off its abilities in front of a mere painter. His face was dark like water. He only stared at Li Yunxin. Seeing this, the Qing army and the Li army knew that Kong Tongzi was going to attack Li Yunxin. Some people wanted to come closer to watch the show, but Kong Tongzi shouted sternly, "Wait!" He usually traveled with the Li army and did not have a good temper. But most of the time his face was dark. It was rare for him to show anger like this. Because of this shout, no one dared to come closer. Since the confrontation between the Li army and the Qing army had been resolved by Kong Tongzi, Su Mao moved to Ding Min's side. So just now someone helped him? Then he frowned. Who? They were just mortals without much knowledge. Of course, they did not know who it was. However, the person he was asking was none other than Primordial Chaos Z. Kong Tongzi, the sword cultivator, was not in the mood to listen to them talk about how this Taoist Hun Yuanzi killed the old fox last night. Kong Tongzi also did not see this Taoist priest Hun Yuanzi's demeanor on the hillside, nor did he hear his tone of voice. But in Ding Min and Su Mao's eyes, his confidence and nonchalance, it should be built on strong confidence and ability. So could it be? But Ding Min only glanced at Su Mao and did not say anything. He turned his head and saw that on the distant slope, Kong Tongzi was staring at Li Yunxin for a while. However, Li Yunxin didn't show any fear on his face. He just frowned and asked, "What's the matter?" Kong Tongzi suddenly sneered and clasped his hands behind his back, saying, "The heavens are merciful. I'm just telling you that you don't have long to live." Li Yunxin was still frowning. "Many people have said this to me in the past, and I'm still alive and well. What are you trying to say?" Kong Tongzi shook his head. "There's no need to argue with I. I'm not in the mood to intimidate you. It's just because you met me and had a fate with me. You can't make the decision on this matter. If you want to blame something, you can only blame yourself for being born unlucky. The reason why I'm telling you this now is not because I really see you as an opponent or an enemy. You don't have that qualification. It's just that the heavens are merciful. After slaughtering the meat on the cloud mountain, we still have to recite a scripture about reincarnation. For you it's just a routine rule. This is also a rule that I set for myself." Kong Tongzi smiled. "When I saw you before, I didn't like you, because you were born beautiful. But this dislike isn't enough to make me kill you. That's also troublesome. However, I was injured in the battle with the demon just now, and because I experienced the great terror of life and death, I might have entered a tribulation." Kong Tongzi paused. "I don't know what tribulation it is, but once I think of your face, or think of how you cowered to survive just now, my thoughts are very unclear. This is the critical period of entering a tribulation, so I can't let it go." When Kong Tongzi said these words, Li Yunxin's expression was still calm. But the swordsman could see that this primordial chaos, the painter was actually trying to suppress some emotions in his heart, to prevent them from showing on his face. It should be fear. So he looked at Li Yunxin and said another sentence. "What a coincidence. I haven't passed the killing tribulation yet." But this primordial chaos, at least on his face, still didn't show any reaction. Kong Tongzi realized one thing, and then looked at Li Yunxin and suddenly laughed. This painter probably didn't know what the killing tribulation was, right? Just at this moment, he suddenly felt a little dull. It was like a man saying a lot of proclamations to an ant. But how could the ant understand what the man said? So he sighed and looked up at Li Yunxin. "I should have killed you on the spot. But just now a master passed by. Maybe he didn't want to see blood, so I spared your life for now." He carefully looked at Li Yunxin's expression. "When we get out of this Manwan mountain, I'll make my thoughts clearer." Li Yunxin blinked. It was already afternoon. The setting sun shone on his smooth face, and his long eyelashes cast a shadow under his eyes. His pupils also turned pale gold because of the sunlight, like a piece of clear amber. This made Kong Tongzi frown even more. Such a good appearance. Humph. Then the owner of this appearance, Primordial Chaos the painter, said, "So you came to me just because you feel more and more unhappy. So you want to kill me?" Li Yunxin opened his eyes wide. "Just because I'm prettier than you want to kill me? And you want to tell me first, so that you can enjoy my face when I know I'm going to die, but can't escape? You cultivators." Li Yunxin frowned sadly. "Why are you all so perverted?" Kong Tongzi only smiled and didn't say anything more to this painter. He turned and walked away. He had seen many people in the secular world, and knew that not everyone would have the same reaction when faced with the same thing. When faced with life and death, everyone would be afraid, but some people would tremble and cry for mercy, and some people would sing loudly to meet death. Maybe at the end, their courage would disappear. However, there were people who stubbornly held on and refused to show fear even in death. Perhaps this painter belonged to this category. But Kong Tongzi didn't want to tangle with him any longer. This painter could suppress it all he wanted, but he knew how afraid he would be. Because of this, Kong Tongzi felt his thoughts become slightly clearer. It could be seen that this painter deserved to die. Then, this sword cultivator told Di Wujing to prepare the troops, bury the bodies and bandage the wounds. He didn't mention the painter and the Qing army again. That General Red Flame hadn't died. Kong Tongzi sat upright on the horse, thinking as he watched the Li army and the Qing army prepare. Earlier, he had killed many small demons in the mountain, and now he had finally drawn out this big demon. Since the big demon had been wounded and fled, it might draw out something even more terrifying. General Red Flame's master should be that. Yujun Kong Tongzi recalled the two banners he saw behind the banshee earlier. One of them said, Yujun's Ladies was arrow, and the other said General Red Flame's arrow. Arrow and arrow combined, it was undoubtedly a pheasant. That General Red Flame's true body was a pheasant. Then, was she the wife of that real demon Yujun? Then things were really troublesome. Demons were cruel and cunning, but it was said that those big demons who had matured would occasionally have emotions like humans. His wife had been wounded by him, and once Yujun left the nest thinking of this, he suddenly felt a wave of annoyance. He felt that the meridians that had been wounded in the previous battle were also blocked. So he shouted in a low voice, "Let's go. Don't rest tonight. Let's get out of Manwan Mountain first." The Li army and the Qing army had experienced the fierce battle earlier, and knew that the mountain was now a dangerous place. Thus, they had no objections to Kong Tongzi's orders. The Li army was still in front, and the Qing army was behind. They followed the mountain path in a long line. The only difference was that there was a small group of Li soldiers at the very back. Kong Tongzi was also in that group. He had to watch the painter, Hun Yuanzi. In reality, he had to kill him. If he had some other use, such as if that big demon actually came, and throwing him out could buy them some time to escape, then the painter would have died a worthy death. They traveled like this for an hour. Ding Min rode her horse beside Li Yunxin for an hour. When they first met, this old man was very arrogant and looked difficult to get along with. Later, intentionally or not, he began to cheer everyone up in the camp, and they slowly got along. But just now they charged forward with the will to die. They didn't think they would all come back alive. Thus, he said many rude things to Li Yunxin that he normally wouldn't say. Now that they were together again, Ding Min didn't know what to say. He watched as the painter, Hun Yuanzi, rode his horse with the group under the setting sun. The expression on his face was calm, as if he didn't care at all about what had just happened. But Ding Min felt that this old man just didn't show his thoughts on his face. He felt that he could also see that this old man was thinking about some things. The so-called calmness was just an expression of suppressed emotions. In reality, his heart was in turmoil. What did Taoist Kong Tongzi say to him? Did he scold him or? The sun slowly moved west accompanied by the sound of footsteps, armor clashing, and wind in the forest. The horizon darkened slightly, and the forest grew even colder. When he exhaled, his mouth and nose were filled with white mist. Ding Min's legs had gotten sick when he was guarding the border. Once he was cold, he was not very nimble. Thus, he pulled out a cotton robe from the back of the saddle. He wanted to put it on himself, but he suddenly thought of something. He looked at Li Yunxin. "Old Taoist, it's getting cold. Do you want to?" As he spoke, he handed the cotton robe over. There was a distance of a horse between the two. When Li Yunxin heard his words, he turned his head and looked at it, but didn't take it. "Ha!" He snorted coldly, still so filial. After saying this, he frowned. "Will I wear this thing?" Hearing this, Ding Min was slightly stunned, and then he sighed in his heart. He wasn't despicable. He was still happy when he was scolded and despised. But this old man's tone was no different from before. It seemed to mean that at least here, he didn't mind anymore. He was just being polite. Now he smiled, retracted his hand, and put on the robe himself. Then he looked at Li Yunxin. "Old Taoist, what did that Taoist priest say just now? I didn't mean anything else. I just wanted to ask if him." Li Yunxin wasn't as unhappy as Ding Min was worried. On the contrary, the previous unhappy expression on his face disappeared in an instant, replaced by a smile. "He said he wanted to kill me." As he spoke, he winked at Ding Min, as if this was a very funny matter. And this very funny matter had been bottled up in his heart for a long time. Now he could finally share it. Ding Min was slightly stunned. The surrounding Qing soldiers who could hear them also glanced in their direction. Then Ding Min furrowed his brows and lowered his voice. Is the Taoist priest joking? That crazy person just ran in front of me and said with a straight face that he thought I was too beautiful and that he was too ugly. So when he saw me, he felt that his thoughts weren't smooth, so he wanted to kill me to vent his anger. Taoist priest Han Yuanzi didn't seem to mind that the Qing soldiers had heard his words. Did you know? Originally, walking around the mountains with you was very boring. But when it came to this matter, I've already laughed for a full 2 hours and can still laugh for an entire day. These Daotong and Kinzo perverts are simply too cute. After Li Yunxin said these words, he seemed to want to laugh out loud, but forcefully suppressed it. Ding Min and Su Mao met each other's eyes. The Qing soldiers around them also looked at each other and didn't say anything. They also didn't look at Taoist priest Han Yuanzi anymore. Then, Ding Min lowered his voice again. That Taoist Kong Tongzi is also a member of the Xianmen. Why is his murderous intent so heavy? Taoist master, did you hear wrong? Li Yunxin huffed and ignored him. Ding Min thought for a bit and turned her head to glance behind her. Tian was slowly darkening. Thus, the small group of Li soldiers behind the Qing army couldn't be seen clearly in the darkness. He couldn't see where Taoist Kong Tongzi was. He turned his head and lowered his voice even more. Taoist master, you might as well give in. You can't use something like your life in a fit of pique. Li Yunxin smiled coldly and shook his head. Waving his hand, he said, Go on your way. In a bit, there will be more things for you to worry about. He then turned his horse's head and rushed ahead of him. Su Mao had been on his other side the entire time and silently listened to the two of them speak. Looking at Ding Min again, he shook his head slightly. Our Taoist master's personality. Even if he were to be beheaded with a smile, he wouldn't beg for mercy. He's the same as Yen. Ding Min looked worriedly at Li Yunxin's back and furrowed her brows. He won't actually kill someone, right? However, Su Mao only thought for a bit and said something else. Did you hear that? This Taoist master just said that he had things to worry about in a bit. Boss, before General Honghua came, what did he say? Ding Min paused upon hearing these words. Then, she felt the hairs on her back all stand up. Chapter 388. Before the Red Flame General attacked the Li army, their Taoist master Han Yuanzi said, If you don't want to die, don't go. The facts proved that he was right. The few people in front of the Li army, except for Diwu Jing, were all dead. If they had run to the front at that time, there would only be about 30 people left. Just now he said something else. At that time, Ding Min was worried about the fate of this Taoist master, so he didn't take it to heart. Now, after hearing Su Mao's question again, he realized that Li Yunxin's words seemed to have some other meaning. Could it be? When she thought of this, the chill on Ding Min's body intensified. Almost immediately, he turned his head and looked around, trying to find some clues. But there was a dense forest all around. In autumn, the sun set quickly. A quarter of an hour ago, there was still some afterglow in the sky, but a quarter of an hour later, the sun had already disappeared. The coldness and the darkness of the night came together and surrounded everyone. Ding Min looked around, but she couldn't find any clues. Or, he felt that danger was hiding in every corner. So he looked at Su Mao again, and with a little force, he urged the horse to catch up with Li Yunxin. He approached him, frowned, and whispered, Taoist master, what did you mean? Did I see anything? Li Yunxin only shrugged. I didn't see anything. Ding Min was about to relax when he heard this, but Li Yunxin said again, But I smelled something. It was fishy and smelly. Can't you smell it? Ding Min was stunned. He sniffed hard. The autumn night was cold, and after sniffing for a while he coughed. But he only smelled grass, wood, and weapons. There was no fishy or smelly smell. So he said, Taoist master, I didn't. Of course you can't smell it. Li Yunxin yawned, as if this matter was very boring. About a dozen miles away from here, there was another group of cultivated monsters that had taken human form. Even Kong Tongzi probably can't smell it. But I'm a mystic enlightened cultivator. So, he squinted at Ding Min. Tell your men to be careful. Ding Min felt that he hadn't been in a daze for as long as a day in his entire life. He was in a daze again, so the horse slowed down and fell behind Li Yunqin. Su Mao caught up with him and frowned. "Boss, what do you mean?" Ding Min frowned as well. "Our Taoist master said he heard it. He smelled the stench of some kind of monster more than 10 miles away. Do you think he's joking or?" Su Mao blinked his eyes for a while. "This Taoist master of ours sure is unrestrained. He spoke as he pleased. But a dozen li away? It seems like, Chief, do you think he's going to do something?" And, as he spoke, he raised his hand, using his index and middle fingers as the legs of a little man, and walked a few steps on his arm guard. Ding Min frowned. "You mean he's trying to escape?" "Our Taoist master looks like a loose person who doesn't like to be restrained, but he's also very strong." Su Mao looked to his left and right, making sure that Li Jun, who was further behind, couldn't hear them. "He definitely won't bow down to that Taoist master Kong Tongzi. But we don't know the rules between cultivators. What if these things really involve life and death? No matter what kind of person he is, life is always important. Maybe." Ding Min clenched his fist and hit the saddle. "Is he trying to create a mess and take the opportunity to escape? That's why he told us to be careful." Su Mao thought for a while. "If a monster really came, as you heard from Taoist Master Kong Tongzi, it'll be a more terrible big monster. How could he say it so easily?" "That's true." Ding Min nodded. After thinking for a while, he said, "But tell our men to get ready first. If there's a mess, if he really wants to leave, we'll pretend that we didn't see it." These two soldiers of the secular world used their thoughts, within the scope of their understanding, to restore the truth of the entire matter. This was a layer that Li Yunqin hadn't expected. He had heard their conversation clearly. Thus, when he heard them instruct the Qing soldiers to not act rashly if anything happens, he sighed slightly in his heart. These people, when he was a person in his previous life, because of his own reasons, he didn't feel that there was anything special about the world. The entire world was just an environment for him to live in. It was difficult for him to truly integrate into it. Because of this, in this life, whether it was when he abandoned his human body or when he became a demon, there was no conflict or reluctance in his heart. But this life was not the same as before. He slowly began to understand the coldness of human emotions. Although this process was slow, it was continuous. After experiencing the various things in the world of demons and cultivators, he suddenly fell back into the dust and saw the thoughts in the hearts of these weak and powerless secular mortals. When he saw the perhaps stupid but interesting thoughts that rarely existed in the world of demons and cultivators, he finally felt the mortal world that he had no interest in, and had even abandoned like a pair of worn-out shoes, was actually interesting. He smiled in his heart. Once again he felt that entering calamity was also interesting. And so the sky finally turned completely dark. Tonight was the last quarter moon, and the moonlight was very dim. The mountain path was already difficult to walk, and it was even more difficult now. But he didn't dare light a torch. The light of the torch could be seen from several li away. It was practically an announcement to all the demons in the mountain that he was here. So he used a talisman. A small talisman lit up in a special glass lamp and produced a milky white halo of light. This halo of light was blocked by 5 wooden walls. Only one side was glass. Thus the light shot forward. It could illuminate the path, and was not too conspicuous. Regardless of whether it was for the Li army or the Qing army, this was a rare thing. Many soldiers knew of its existence, and had heard old people mention it, and use it before. But now that he had actually seen it, he still felt surprised. But he also knew that this kind of thing was only used when the situation was urgent. Although a cultivator with a state of mind could casually write such a talisman, there were tens of thousands of soldiers in the kingdom of Qing. If each group was equipped with a dozen talismans, it would be a terrifying number. How could there be so many cultivators who did not refine their souls and bodies to do this kind of thing for the mortals of the secular world? Thus the novelty quickly passed. Everyone knew that they were truly taking a risk. They only wanted to get out of the mountain as soon as possible. After another hour, they could finally see the endless plains at the foot of the mountain in the distance. Those with good eyesight could even see the dots of lights on the plains. Although it was sparse, It meant that there were signs of human activity. That light was not from a normal village. It was from the Allied army that had crossed the mountains and slowly set up camp there. It seemed that they could finally relax a little. In the darkness, lights could always bring people hope and a sense of security. Most of the time, when a soldier walking at the very front of this army stepped onto a small hill and pushed aside a clump of dead branches in front of him, he saw an even brighter light. Chapter 389. But it was not the light but the gaze. People said that the gaze was like a torch, and now it was vividly interpreted. There were more than 10 huge beasts. Each of them was as big as a house, and against the dark forest, they were like a series of small mountains blocking the road. The beasts looked like fierce tigers, but their upper and lower lips were like wild boars with fangs protruding out. They had dark golden fur, and their fur was covered with black spots and stripes. However, these terrifying beasts were not looking at the soldiers who had left the army. When the soldier in the lead pushed aside the dead bushes, he saw a dozen or so beasts facing him. Their lantern-like eyes shone with white light, and they were staring at a huge flat rock on the opposite side of the path. It was a big rock, facing the cliff, and beside the rock was an old weird pine tree. The pine tree had turned dark green in autumn, but its needles were still standing upright. This place was already close to the edge of the rolling mountains. Almost everywhere were towering cliffs, and only a few places could allow people and horses to slowly walk down. But they also had to be very careful, or else they would fall into the abyss and die a horrible death if they were not careful. And on the rock there were 2 people. One of them was a middle-aged man, wearing an apricot yellow robe. Perhaps it was a Taoist robe, because the style of his clothes was not the style that people wore nowadays. There were 5 strands of long beard on his face, and his appearance was handsome, but his face was slightly dark, as if he had some unlucky disease. The other person opposite him was also a man, but his appearance was more majestic, and the beard on his cheeks was unusually lush and thick. On his head was a golden crown, but he wore a black robe. The black robe was decorated with golden threads and looked very gorgeous. These 2 people sat opposite each other, with a stone chessboard placed between them. They were actually playing chess. On this kind of night, in this kind of place, they were being stared at by more than 10 fierce beasts. And those fierce beasts were not only fierce beasts. In the shadows behind them, there were also many figures. Seeing all this, Li Bing was stunned for a moment, and did not have time to scream. When he came back to his senses and was about to shout, his comrade beside him covered his mouth and pulled him back. Previously, they had only encountered General Crimson Flame and lost many of their brothers. Now that they saw so many monsters and demons blocking their way, they suddenly felt that there was no chance of survival. But then he heard a low voice coming from behind. "Out of the way! Out of the way!" It was Kong Tongzi who had come to the front. The Li army at the front hurriedly retreated, but they also felt a little more at ease. They didn't know anything about Taoist magic, and they didn't know anything about demons and devils, but this Taoist priest Kong Tongzi had been slaying demons and devils along the way. Maybe with his presence, there would be a chance to turn things around. Kong Tongzi walked to the front of the withered branch, held his breath and looked ahead. Then his heart sank. The mortal soldier's eyesight was not as good as his, so they could not see clearly. But he could clearly see that General Red Flame was among the crowd behind the dozen or so ferocious beasts. And it wasn't a crowd, but a group of demons and devils. Every one of them had the appearance of a human, and their eyes and movements were quite clever. Obviously, they were not those stupid low-level demons, but all of them were demons and devils. Each of them had the same cultivation level as those he had killed before. So many demons and devils were gathered here. Kong Tongzi sucked in a breath of cold air. Could it really be that Yu Jun came? But that was a great demon king of the true realm. Why would he really come here to make things difficult for him? Halfway through this breath of cold air, a few thoughts flashed through his mind. Actually, it wasn't that he didn't have the thought of abandoning this group of soldiers and running away by himself. But this time, he didn't follow the army to walk in the secular world, but to carry out a mission from the celestial sect. The war was imminent, and these low-level cultivators also had to do their part. If he ran away by himself and the sect found out about this, it would not be a good thing. The sect naturally didn't care about these mortals, but that sect leader Jingguangzi hated people who didn't listen to her orders the most. In front of a true realm cultivator, he didn't dare to play any tricks. But at this moment, Kong Tongzi really had the thought of retreating. In front of these demons and devils, there was only one thing waiting for him: death. Between the imminent threat of death and the possible punishment that would come a long time later, any smart person would know which one to choose. Therefore, he gritted his teeth, prepared to gently put down the withered branch in his hand, and took 3 or 4 steps back to appease these soldiers. Then he would escape under the cover of the night. But just as this thought came into his mind, he heard someone speak among the demons. And that sentence made him frown slightly, temporarily suppressing this thought in his mind. The one who spoke was General Honghua. This female demon had already wrapped up the wound on her head, and seemed to be fine. She jumped up from the group of demons and landed on the huge head of a wild beast, and shouted at the 2 people. "You 2 are very bold. How dare you block King Yujun's way? Where did you leaders come from?" It turned out that the 2 people on the rock were not with them, but the 2 men who were playing against each other didn't answer her immediately. Instead, they played 2 moves in silence. After General Honghua shouted that sentence, she didn't rush them, but just stared at them angrily. And the demons behind her also didn't make a sound, looking as if they were extremely afraid of these 2 people. When the black-robed and bearded handsome man put down another piece, he raised his head and looked at General Honghua. "King Yu, humph, where did this little demon come from? How dare you show off here?" He sneered and said, "Block King Yujun's way? Hey, let me ask you, you demons, are you looking for trouble with a group of soldiers who left the army?" General Honghua was slightly startled, not because they knew about this, but because, although she couldn't see through the cultivation of these 2 people, she knew that they were far above her. Maybe they were 2 true realm cultivators. 2 true realm cultivators, caring about the life and death of more than 100 mortals? She frowned. "So what if we are? Are you going to stand up for those mortals?" The bearded man suddenly raised his eyebrows and laughed. "So what if we are?" "Humph." He stood up. His body was extremely tall, almost 2 heads taller than ordinary people. "Do you think the people of the Li Kingdom can be touched by you bastards? Just now, which blind bastard killed the people of the Li Kingdom? Obediently come to me and accept your death." His words were not only heard by the demons, but also by Kong Tongzi and the Li Kingdom soldiers behind him. They were all startled. Kong Tongzi hurriedly narrowed his eyes and looked at the bearded man again. He originally thought that it was just an internal conflict between the demons. But now that he said these words, he was actually full of righteousness and wanted to protect them, not at all like an evil demon. He looked at the handsome middle-aged man in front of the bearded man again. Although he didn't look good, he looked like a dragon and a phoenix, and didn't have the temperament of an ordinary demon. Could it be he had met a master who helped him? That master was these 2. They were actually protecting them all the way. Chapter 390. Kong Tongzi's heart skipped a beat, and he let out a sigh of relief. If these 2 were really masters of Xianmen, what was there to be afraid of tonight? Although he didn't have much contact with big monsters, he knew that although they were cruel and violent, once they reached the real state, they also cherished their lives very much. If the 2 of them were true realm experts from the Profound Gate, Yujun would never understand why the great general of Red Flame was so stubborn and fought to the point where both sides suffered great losses. Now that he had calmed down a little, he decided to observe for a while, wait for the 2 masters to retreat. Then he would go forward to pay his respects. He rarely saw high-level cultivators. Even his own sect leader, Jing Guangzi, in the past 10 years, he had only seen him a few times. A word or a talisman from an expert could contain exquisite wisdom and truth. He really wanted to grasp this opportunity, so that he could take a step forward on the path of cultivation. But at this moment, General Red Flame suddenly let out a muffled snort. "Die!" How arrogant you are. I will kill a few more in front of you tonight. Let's see what you can do. As soon as her voice fell, she raised her hand and made a grabbing motion. She was also at the transcendent state, so it wasn't easy for her to deal with Kong Tongzi. But it was a piece of cake for her to deal with the mortals around him. This time, it seemed that she made a move with hatred in her heart, and a scream was heard. The two soldiers around Kong Tongzi were suddenly grabbed by her, and their bodies were broken into several pieces in midair. Their blood splashed all over the ground, right in front of the two men on the rock. She had already found them. At this moment, how could Kong Tongzi act like a coward in front of these two masters? Without thinking, he jumped out of the thicket with his sword and shouted, "What a witch! How dare you be so arrogant in front of the masters of Xianmen?" Kong Tongzi was facing more than a dozen fierce beasts and hundreds and thousands of enlightened monsters. But there was not even a trace of fear on his face. Instead, his clothes fluttered in the wind, and he stood with his sword. Although his face was ugly, his temperament was heroic. But he was not stupid. After saying these bold words, under the watchful eyes of the crowd, he rose and fell a few more times, and landed on the side of the big green rock. He didn't dare to raise his eyes to look at the two experts on the rock, and only lowered his head slightly, hugging his sword and bowing. "I am a sword cultivator of the Kinzo five-line sword sect, Kong Tongzi. I was ordered by my master to escort a group of soldiers to Mangwan Mountain to investigate the situation of the demons. A few days ago, I encountered this demoness. Fortunately, the two of you helped me in secret. I hereby thank you." After saying these words, he did not dare to raise his head, and only stared at the ground 3 inches in front of his feet. But strangely enough, when he jumped out, the demons didn't make any noise. He seemed to have been thrown into confusion by this sudden scene, and didn't know what to do. For a moment, the wind and moon on the large green rock were silent. Only the blood from the Li army corpses that had been crushed in the air flowed along the lines of the green rock like a small stream. After a dozen breaths, Kong Tongzi also began to feel strange. He couldn't resist raising his head to look when he heard the sound of clothes rustling. It seemed that the curly-bearded Taoist who had stood up earlier had sat down again. He then heard the man say, "So the one who protected these people along the way was you?" Hearing this voice, Kong Tongzi's earlier bit of hesitation completely disappeared. When the man spoke, there was a righteous aura in his voice. This was not something a normal demon could pretend to be. He had to be an accomplished master. Thus he gathered his thoughts and hurriedly said, "Yes. I was ordered by my master." The curly-bearded man did not seem to be interested in these things and quickly interrupted him. "So the earth god was also killed by you?" Kong Tongzi paused and thought for a moment before realizing what the earth god was referring to. The Qing soldiers said that the painter accompanying them had killed some old fox, and was calling himself the earth god. At the time, he didn't think much of it. He only thought that if a painter could kill it, it had to be an unranked little demon. Earlier, when General Hong Hua had blocked the way, she had specifically mentioned, whoever killed her personally granted the land. Now this curly-bearded Taoist had mentioned it again. It seemed that he had also heard it from General Hong Hua. That old fox, what kind of god was he? At this moment, Kong Tongzi slightly regretted that he hadn't investigated in more detail. Just as he was hesitating, he heard the general of Red Flame yell, "That old thing is a good-for-nothing, but according to people, he is the father-in-law of our king. Are you going to meddle in this matter?" Hearing these words, Kong Tongzi already had a plan in his heart. It looked like that old fox was quite a character. Then, wasn't that a meritorious service? He immediately raised his hands again and lowered his head. In a low voice he said, "Taoist, that old fox was killed by I." He then turned his head slightly to look at General Hong Hua and laughed coldly. "Everyone has the right to punish evil and unorthodox sections, let alone a mere fox demon. Do you dare to be presumptuous in front of these 2 Taoist priests?" General Hong Hua glared at him and shouted in a delicate voice, "You? I've already fought with you just now. How could your means be able to deal with his wind of primordial chaos?" I think. While saying this, she rolled her eyes and grabbed something next to her. "Someone else did it, right?" The withered tree that had been blocking Li Jun's path was immediately torn into pieces, revealing the hundreds of people behind it. The female monster's eyes wandered back and forth among these people for a while. Suddenly, she fixed her eyes on Li Yunxin. She stared at him for a while. Li Yunxin was in the crowd at this time. His unique attire was very eye-catching. The expression on his face was even more eye-catching. His face was calm and carefree, as if he was extremely bored. It was as if the terrible situation here did not affect him at all. And it was all just a joke. General Hong Hua looked at him and pointed at him. Was it you? He didn't seem to be taken seriously by the female monster. This made Kong Tongzi's face heat up. He frowned and said in a deep voice, "He is just a painter." "Humph. I am a cultivator of Kinzo's 5-line sword sect. How can an ignorant demon like you guess my means?" The bearded Taoist sighed. He seemed to feel that the two of them arguing was very boring. Kong Tongzi immediately stopped talking and waited for the expert to make a decision. The bearded Taoist sighed and said, "In short, it was either him or him, right?" This sounded like he was talking to General Hong Hua. Then he raised his hand and waved. "Then you can take these two people away. They are not children of my Li Kingdom. But if you take these two away, and tell me about that land of yours, humph, I'll settle the score with you for killing my people." Kong Tongzi was stunned because of the words of the bearded Taoist. People of the Li Kingdom? Hand me and the painter over to the demon. What does he mean? He subconsciously raised his head. Before, he was afraid of the majesty of these two experts. When he came close, he bowed his head and didn't dare to look at them directly. Because it was night, and the light was not good, he didn't see what the bearded Taoist's Taoist robe looked like. But now he raised his head in surprise and finally saw it clearly. That was not a Taoist robe. The black robe of this bearded Taoist was embroidered with golden thread. It was the totem of the 5 fierce beasts and 5 birds. This was the totem of the Li Kingdom's royal family. Before he could come to a conclusion in his mind, he suddenly heard Di Wujing's voice behind him. Di Wujing was a man like an iron tower. Usually, his voice was calm and a little hoarse. But now, his voice was sharp and thin, as if an invisible hand was strangling him. This Dutu commander of the Li Kingdom's howling army ran a few steps forward on the path. He didn't care about those terrible beasts at all. He ran until he reached the big green rock. Then he knelt down. His eyes were straight, and his lips were trembling. "Your Majesty? Your Majesty! I, Dutu commander of the howling army, Di Wujing, kowtow to your Majesty." A chill suddenly climbed up Kong Tongzi's body. It came from his tailbone and went up his spine to the top of his head in an instant. He widened his eyes and stared at the bearded Taoist. He couldn't say a word. He also heard Di Wujing kowtow 3 times and 9 times under the big green rock. He also heard him say things like, "I had the honor to see your Majesty in the 32nd year of the Upper Yuan dynasty. Come and kowtow to your Majesty. Your Majesty is wise and mighty. I knew your Majesty wouldn't die like this." And so on. After a dozen breaths, Kong Tongzi's legs went soft and he fell to the ground. His teeth chattered. You are Emperor Li? That is, Emperor Li of the mysterious realm." Chapter 391. This Kinzo cultivator fell into a terrible and desperate situation. No wonder the words of this curly-bearded Taoist were so mighty. He was the ghost emperor whose soul was not taken away after his death. He had gathered the power of wishes of millions of people in the Li Kingdom to reach the mysterious realm, and was close to the Grand Supreme, Emperor Li. He had the aura of an emperor. Such a terrible big demon. No, it could not be described as a big demon anymore. Which big demon in the world could kill 3 mysterious realm, and 2 real realm cultivators of Daotong and Kinzo, as soon as they achieved the Tao? And he actually sent himself in front of such a terrifying fiendish demon. But whether he was afraid or surprised, this Emperor Li didn't seem to care. This ghost emperor didn't look at him. Instead, he looked at Di Wujing, who was under the green stone. 80 or 90 Li soldiers were already kneeling. Some were shouting, "Long live the emperor." Some dared not make a sound, and some only buried their faces on the ground, not daring to move. Many of them had heard that the dead emperor became a ghost cultivator. With such a big movement and the battle witnessed by so many people, even Daotong and Kinzo couldn't hide it. But now they really saw it. This kind of thing was beyond the endurance of many people. In such an era, the emperor was like a god in the hearts of mortals. And this one in front of them was an emperor who had the magical power of a god. This emperor Li snorted softly and stood up again. He walked over Kong Tongzi, who was sitting on the ground with his hands behind his back, and walked to the big green stone. After I became a ghost cultivator, there are many things I can't remember. But there are many things I remember more clearly. He frowned slightly and looked at Diwu Jing, who was under the stone. Raise your head. Diwu Jing immediately raised his head. His eyes were bright and looked straight into the eyes of the ghost emperor, which was a sharp contrast with Kong Tongzi. I remember you. Emperor Li looked at him and nodded slightly. In the 32nd year of the Upper Yuan dynasty, I was in a good mood, and it was the Lantern Festival. So I called the officer of the Xiao Luo army, who was in the capital, to drink on the golden platform. You are Lu Tianji's bodyguard, right? Diwu Jing was so excited that his face turned red. Yes. At that time, I was General Lu's bodyguard. What virtue or ability did I have that your majesty would remember me? Emperor Li snorted. I am no longer a mortal. He became a ghost cultivator. Aren't you afraid to see me? Diwu Jing immediately said loudly, Your Majesty. I still remember on the golden platform during the Lantern Festival, His Majesty said to General Lu, Your bodyguard looks mighty and looks like a talented general. That's why I'm here today. Your Majesty's kindness to me can't be repaid in this life, the next life, and the next. Moreover, as he said this, a look of hatred appeared on his face. Since His Majesty passed away, the court has been filled with traitors, and the throne has been controlled by vile people. The Great Li dynasty has. Hearing this, Emperor Li raised his eyebrows and said, Ah, the throne is controlled by a villain? Which villain? Is it Prince Jin? Diwu Jing said loudly, Yes. Emperor Li suddenly laughed and said, Haha. When I was on the throne, many people spoke ill of Prince Jin, but I felt that they were forming a clique to attack the crown prince. Lu Tianji was stripped of his military position and sent back to Tong province because he complained to King Jin. Until now. Humph. I was stupid at that time. Emperor Li squinted his eyes and said, It was this Prince Jin who colluded with the Freemasonry and killed me. Diwu Jing turned pale with fright. Even the Li soldiers behind him, upon hearing this, temporarily forgot their fear and looked at each other in dismay. Forget it. Emperor Li suddenly waved his sleeves and said, After I died, I realized that there is another bigger world. The Li Kingdom. What is the territory of mortals? This debt will be settled sooner or later. As for you, you are still my people. Go down the mountain. Leave the rest to this. Yujun Diwu Jing did not speak, but Kong Tongzi suddenly shouted, Ghost King, Ghost King. I didn't kill that old fox, it was that painter. Keep him. I am the messenger of the sword faction. You can't hand me over to that Yujun. After saying this, he sat on the ground and turned to Diwu Jing and shouted, General Diwu, you can ask His Majesty for me. I've been slaying demons with you all along the way. I've also saved your lives. Usually, Kong Tongzi held his head high and behaved like an otherworldly expert. But now, he showed his ugly side and was even less courageous than a mortal. Diwu Jing frowned because of this. After hesitating for a while, he was about to speak, but he heard someone else speak. The one who spoke was the man in the yellow robe sitting opposite Emperor Li. This man had been staring at the chessboard and listening quietly. Now he coughed and said, People of the Li Kingdom can go, but none of the Qing and I can go. After he said this, Emperor Li turned to him and said, Brother, you still can't let it go? The man in the yellow robe stood up and laughed. He looked at Emperor Li and said, Let it go? You and I are both ghost cultivators. Since we are ghost cultivators, we have an obsession that turned into this Dharmakaya. If we really let it go, how can it still exist in the world? What's more? He frowned and said, The Qing and I destroyed my country and harmed my people. Humph, this debt will never be settled. People already knew that this Emperor Li was the Wu Wei Emperor of the Li Kingdom, who died a few months ago. And now, hearing this man talk about country and people, Kong Tongzi was stunned again. Who was this man? But after a few breaths of time, he once again widened his eyes. Although his cultivation was low, he was well informed. So he knew that the Langia cave of Daotong had gone to the river Wei of the Qing kingdom. It was said that in the city of Wei, they fought with a terrible demon, the dragon Jiuqi, and lost many people. There was also a strange thing in the process. It was said that the soul of the previous dynasty of the Qing kingdom, the last emperor of the Yi kingdom, Emperor Yi Zhaowu, LV Zhunyang, had not been taken away by the black and white Yama kings after his death. At that time, the ghost emperor of the Yi kingdom and the dragon Jiuqi also stirred up trouble. Later, they were defeated by the masters of the Langia cave. Could it be? You are the Zhaowu emperor of the Yi kingdom, LV Zhunyang? Kong Tongzi stared at him in disbelief. He also saw the pattern embroidered on his yellow robe. It was a dark golden tiger with 2 heads. It was indeed the emblem of the royal family of the Yi kingdom. LV Zhunyang snorted and said, "You are quite knowledgeable." Kong Tongzi was stunned for a while, and suddenly rushed up to hug his leg and said, Ghost King, since you want to take revenge on the people of the Qing kingdom, let me tell you. Among the people of the Qing kingdom, there is a painter with powerful magic. Yes, powerful magic. He was the one who killed the old fox. Ghost King, think about it. He is just a painter, but his cultivation has reached such a level. He must be from a noble family of the Qing kingdom royal family. He must have been fed with elixirs to be like this. Kong Tongzi said all this in one breath. He then raised his hand and pointed at the Qing army. It is that person. Chapter 392. The ghost emperor LV Zhunyang listened to his words and looked in the direction he was pointing. With just one glance, he immediately furrowed his brows. Kong Tongzi looked at him fearfully, afraid to miss any trace of expression on his face. Because he did not want to die here today. He still had many things to do, many things that other people and important people thought were unimportant, but to him, were the most important things in his life to do. He had always done things cautiously. This time, coming to the mountains to kill demons was the most daring adventure he had taken since he started cultivating. He had originally thought that with his cultivation, he would not run into a great demon. The Daotong Kenzo had so many true realm masters, and the great demons had to be on guard against them. He did not think that he would run into 3 of them. Now he could only rely on his brain. He knew that although the great demons were smarter than normal demons, they were, after all, birds and beasts. Their intelligence could not compare to that of a human. He also knew that although a ghost cultivator was once a human, since he became a ghost cultivator, he had to have an obsession. He had to rely on his brain to mediate in this dangerous situation and fight for a way out for himself. Since the ghost emperor hated the people of the Qing kingdom, he would not be able to control himself when he saw the royal family of the Qing kingdom. First, he would give him the hateful painter. Then, he would observe carefully and temporarily pretend to be weak. He would look for an opportunity to provoke them to fight with the Yujun. It was not impossible to leave the mountains alive. Thinking of this, and seeing the expression on the ghost emperor LV Zhunyang's face, Kong Tongzi felt a little better. It was fine as long as he frowned. He gathered his courage and said, Ghost Emperor, look carefully. That child humiliated I in every way possible, because he was a noble in the secular world. I was a cultivator and did not care about him. In the end, he went from bad to worse and tried to harm I when we met the general of Red Flame. This kind of behavior, whether it is a human, a ghost, or a demon, is despicable and vicious. As he said this, he saw LV Zhunyang staring at the painter with his brows furrowed even tighter. He felt more at ease. Thus he stood up from the ground, gritted his teeth and turned to Emperor Li. Ghost King, I did not hesitate to risk my life to protect your people. Yet he and the Qing soldiers are watching from the sidelines from the back, watching as we go to our deaths. Do you think you can tolerate such a thing? Before Emperor Yi spoke, Emperor Li stared at Di Wujing and said, I hate those vicious people who secretly do bad things. Di Wujing, is what the Taoist said true? Diwu Jing hesitated for a while, not knowing if he should tell the truth or defend Kong Tongzi. Kong Tongzi had fought side by side with them before, so they were comrades after all. If someone else had asked him, he wouldn't have hesitated to say, "What he said is true." But now it was Emperor Li who asked him. His reverence for the ghost emperor made him hesitant. At this moment a young man suddenly shouted, "Bullsh*T. When did we sit back and do nothing? When did we want to harm you?" The person who spoke was none other than the soft-skinned but hot-tempered Yan Er. The Qing soldiers saw the situation in front of them and heard these words. Even if they didn't know the inside story, they knew they were in a hopeless situation. Under these circumstances, as mortals, their lives were in the hands of demons. In other words, there was no way out. Since there was no way out, they wouldn't lose their courage like Kong Tongzi, who still had a glimmer of hope. Thus, when Yan Er heard these words, anger rose in his heart, and evil grew in his heart. He was the first to jump out, onto the hill next to the path. He wore a soft leather armor, and held a longbow in his hand. As he cursed, he took out 3 arrows from the quiver on his waist, knocked them and shot. "I'm going to die today anyway, so I'll send you on your way first, you shameless Taoist priest." As soon as he finished speaking, he used the method of shooting arrows in rapid succession. 3 arrows whooshed toward Kong Tongzi's face. The wind was strong, the sky was dark, and they were far away. But these 3 arrows were terrifyingly accurate. The first arrow was about to hit the bridge of his nose, but Kong Tongzi caught it with his hand. The second arrow hit the tail of the first arrow, but it didn't split it. Instead, it nailed it forward a little. Yan Er's arrows were specially made, and the tail was made of fine iron. Kong Tongzi was slightly stunned. He was a cultivator, and this was the first time he saw a mortal with such exquisite skills. It could be called magical. While he was still in a daze, the third arrow had already arrived. It had hit the tail of the second arrow, and nailed the arrow. He was holding on to a little further forward. It was only a little bit, but the arrow had finally pierced through his skin. But Kong Tongzi was also a cultivator in the transcendent state, and his body was much stronger than a mortal's. The arrowhead left a small wound on his body, and could not go any further. It only pierced out a drop of blood. However, this drop of blood had already shocked and enraged Kong Tongzi. A cultivator in the transcendent state was injured by a mortal. A wave of anger rose up in his chest. He exerted force in his palm, and the arrow shaft immediately shattered into pieces. Then he widened his eyes and shouted, "Two ghost kings, let I help you take care of this mortal who doesn't know what's good for him." A fight between a transcendent state sword cultivator and a mortal was like a fight between ants in the eyes of the big demons. Who would care? Emperor Li didn't even look at him, and only said to Emperor Yi, "Brother, what are you thinking about? Is there anything special about that painter?" Emperor Yi Zhenyang frowned again. That person seems familiar. The person he was talking about was sitting on a short horse and looking at Emperor Li. Emperor Li, other than the World Two Sages, Shinryu and Golden Rock, he was the demon closest to the Taishang state. Li Yunxin really wanted to see something different about him, but he didn't know if it was because his cultivation was limited, or because Emperor Li's cultivation was too high, but he couldn't see anything different. Like Emperor Li, he didn't care about the fights between the mortals and low-level cultivators. But the others couldn't be as calm as him. Yan Er jumped up the hill and shot 3 arrows. Ding Min grabbed Li Yunxin's hand and didn't care about etiquette anymore. "Taoist, who is that person? Qing and I. What is he talking about?" This was the first time he disregarded etiquette and touched Li Yunxin's physical body, and he did it in a moment of desperation. But even so, he felt something was wrong. This Taoist Hun Yuanzi's hand was so cold. It was an autumn night, and it was naturally cold. When the armor touched his neck, it was so cold that he sucked in a breath. But this Taoist Hun Yuanzi's hand was as cold as the armor. It was as if he didn't have any body temperature. He was the same temperature as the outside. Because of this, he was stunned and quickly let go of his hand. But Li Yunxin squinted his eyes and didn't care about his actions. It was as if what they were doing had nothing to do with him. Ding Min had seen this when they were saved by Old Fox for the first time. He also saw it when the Li army fought against General Honghua. At that time, he always felt that there was a reason for it. The first time he saved them, he acted like a master. Naturally, he didn't care. The second time he watched the Li army fight against the demons, he also said that he hated Kong Tongzi. But now, in front of such a powerful enemy, in such a desperate situation, he still acted like this. Ding Min was a smart person, so he suddenly realized that maybe he had been thinking about this Taoist Hun Yuanzi wrongly. It wasn't that he was a master, or hated Kong Tongzi. But he really didn't care. Everything he did didn't have a clear goal, or desire like the secular people. He just did what he wanted to do, and didn't do what he didn't want to do. Just like now, he didn't want to escape, and he wasn't in a hurry to escape. So he was as steady as a mountain. Ding Min froze for a moment, then looked at Li Yunxin one last time. Then he turned his horse, and walked away from him. He realized that this Taoist Hun Yuanzi wouldn't save them, or make plans for them just because he asked. It was just like when the young masters of the rich families in the capital met a pitiful beggar on the road. If they were in a good mood, they would throw a piece of silver, or even have someone take the beggar back into their manor. If this beggar thought he could beg that noble person for everything, then he was delusional. Ding Min jumped off his horse. Kong Tongzi had taken 3 arrows from Yin Air, and was furious. This commander knew that they were on the edge of life and death, and that the enemy was not someone they could fight against. Thus, he pulled out the short knife at his waist, and ruthlessly stabbed it into the butt of the warhorse he was riding. The warhorse whinnied in pain and charged forward into the Li army formation. On this narrow mountain path, the Li army was a mess. Men and horses were thrown off their feet. Then Ding Min shouted, "Everyone run for your lives! Those who escape, tell everyone what happened today." He was an old soldier who had seen life and death, so he was very decisive. While many of the Qing soldiers were still watching and hoping for a fluke, he knew there was no way to retreat. They had to take advantage of the chaos to split up and break out. Thus, the Li army and Kong Tongzi were both slightly stunned. After this moment, many of the Qing soldiers copied him and scared away the war horses and the pack horses transporting the red earth. For a moment, although there were only a few dozen horses, the mountain path became even narrower. There was the power of tens of thousands of horses galloping. The dark night became a mess. Kong Tongzi's anger finally exploded. Seeing that the ghost emperor was not displeased, he raised his hand and raised his flying sword. "Run! Where do you think you're going? First, I'll take your painter's dog head and offer it to the ghost king." Li Yunxin had used this method before, and she liked it very much. First, please the enemy so that they would let down their guard. Then she would slowly plot against them. Kong Tongzi used it with ease. In the chaos, he stared at the eye-catching white-robed Hun Yuanzi. Thinking that he was scared silly, he stabbed forward with his sword. His flying sword had been damaged in the battle with General Honghua earlier. Although it was still green and hazy, its light flickered and did not move very quickly. Even so, it was still much faster than the arrows of secular people. After he shouted this, the flying sword immediately arrived in front of Hun Yuanzi's face. The killing intent he had been holding back for a long time was finally temporarily released. In that instant, Kong Tongzi felt his body was incomparably comfortable. Even his blood began to heat up in the cold autumn night. Then his blood froze again. Li Yunxin raised his hand and caught his flying sword, just like how he had caught Yin Er's arrow earlier. He used 2 fingers. Chapter 393. A flying sword of a swordsman in the transcendent realm had been refined for decades with his life. Cutting through metal and stone was like cutting through water and air. At this moment, it stopped in his fingers and could not move. The little sword buzzed and trembled for a while. It was Kong Tongzi's eyes widening in disbelief. After experiencing extreme shock, he made one last effort to pull back the flying sword. Li Yunxin raised his eyebrows. He raised his other hand and flicked the flying sword. With a clear clang, the trembling flying sword immediately stopped moving like a dead fish. The light on its surface quickly dimmed, and it quickly became a heavy, dead object. A mouthful of blood sprayed out of Kong Tongzi's mouth. He once again fell limply to the ground. But this time, it wasn't because of fear. Instead, it was because that casual strike just now had destroyed the spiritual energy on his flying sword. His cultivation was greatly damaged, and his physical body was also heavily injured. He couldn't even stand steadily. He stared straight at Li Yunxin and said in a raspy voice, "You, what happened? What happened to you?" At this moment, he finally realized that this Han Yuanzi was not a painter, but a person with a very high cultivation, at least far above his own. Earlier, he had encountered the two ghost emperors and felt fear in his heart. He only wanted to feign civility and beg for a way out. Now that he knew that Li Yunxin was not a painter with a low cultivation, he felt a different kind of emotion. He had always hated it when people talked about his appearance. When he saw Li Yunxin, he saw that he was pretty and thought that he was just a body. But he was just a mortal. His cultivation would be the same as heaven and earth. How could he compare to him? Now, his flying sword had been destroyed, and his cultivation had been greatly damaged. Even continuing to cultivate might be an extravagant hope. Yet he found that not only was this Han Yuanzi beautiful, but his cultivation was above his own. The heavens were so unfair. He then thought of how he had mocked and ridiculed this person along the way, and how the Li and Qing armies had all seen it. Now seeing this scene, didn't they all think of him as a laughingstock? That despicable person had probably been purposefully watching him make a fool of himself along the way. New hatred and old hatred welled up in his chest. His heart was filled with shame and indignation. He no longer cared about his life or his dignity. With one hand on the ground, he suddenly raised his other hand and pointed at Li Yunxin with a trembling finger. "You actually humiliated I along the way. You." The Qing soldiers, who had fled in all directions with their frightened horses, also saw this scene. They were all as stunned as Kong Tongzi. They only knew that Han Yuanzi was a master, but they had never thought he would be this powerful. With one strike, he had defeated the swordsman who they thought was powerful. Li Jun was also stunned. For a moment, more than 100 people were stunned on the mountain road. They only saw and heard Kong Tongzi continue, "You have now destroyed my cultivation, and let these useless things see what I am now. Have you finally resolved the hatred you have been holding all this way? You." In the past, he had acted like a piece of trash in front of the two ghost emperors, but most of it was done on purpose to show weakness. Thus, even though he looked fearful, he was still able to speak with assurance. Now that he knew that his cultivation had almost been destroyed, and that the person who had harmed him was such a person, he almost couldn't speak. He gritted his teeth and glared at Li Yunxin. He knew that he would be humiliated in a moment. That bastard had endured silently all this way, waiting for this moment. It was simply. Then, Li Yunxin finally sat on the horse, and casually threw the little sword that had lost its light to the ground. The moment it landed, half of it immediately stuck into the rock. Then, he jumped off the horse, and only used 3 steps to reach the large rock. These 3 steps stunned the Qing soldiers, Li Jun, and even Kong Tongzi. He was more than 100 steps away from the rock, but his steps were elegant and calm. graceful and calm, and no one could see how he had crossed such a long distance. He stopped in front of Kong Tongzi. Kong Tongzi gritted his teeth and stared at him, waiting for him to lower his head and speak to him with either pride, arrogance, or pity. However, Li Yunxin took another step and swept past him. Does Brother Lu not remember that Li Yunxin in the city of Wei? Li Yunxin looked at Yi Emperor Lu Zhenyang with a slight smile. We've been apart for a few months. I didn't know how you were. It wasn't until I saw you and knew that you were all right that my heart fell to the ground. Kong Tongzi froze in place. It wasn't because he had a slight impression of the name, Li Yunxin. It was because he was ignoring him. Was he treating him like he didn't exist? Li Yunxin stood with the 2 ghost emperors on the lone pine and bluestone beside the rolling cliffs. These 2 ghost emperors were both powerful demons. In particular, Emperor Li was famous for his viciousness. No one did not fear him. However, Li Yunxin's aura was not weak at all in front of them. He was tall and slender and wore white clothing. The sleeves of his robe fluttered in the autumn wind, like an immortal who could fly away at any moment. In the eyes of the Qing soldiers who had been fleeing in all directions, this scene stunned them for a moment. He already knew that this Taoist priest Han Yuanzi was beautiful and elegant, but now that this beauty was paired with such a powerful aura, it was more than 1,000 times more shocking. Because of this, they all stopped in their tracks. Many of them had fled with Ding Min and Su Mao. At this point, he hesitated and asked what he should do, because fleeing in all directions was the worst plan. Let's not talk about whether he could avoid the beasts and the demon soldiers in the mountains. Even if they avoided it, once they left Manwan Mountain and reached the Qing army camp near Tongtian Swamp, they would lose all the red soil they were transporting. It would be difficult to report back. Ding Min leaned on her saber and stood on the hill. She stared at the white figure on the bluestone with a frown, dumbfounded. It wasn't that he hadn't thought this Taoist priest was powerful, but he hadn't thought he was this powerful. He wasn't stupid. Looking at Kong Tongzi's appearance, he already knew how terrifying those two emperors of the gods were. But now, this Taoist priest Han Yuanzi, who called himself Li Yunqin, was standing in front of them. Furthermore, he looked as if he had known him a long time ago. Who exactly was he? Thus, he took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Let's wait and see." He thought for a bit, but his gaze never left Li Yunqin's body. "We've already scared the horses just now. We can't report back on this mission. Our general died again. If we return to the camp now, we won't have a good ending. Perhaps he can still save us." After he finished saying these words to the soldiers behind him, he heard the ghost king on the bluestone who called them Qing and I say, "Li Yunqin?" There was some confusion in his voice, as if he wasn't sure. After a moment his voice became certain. "Li Yunqin, I remember you." Emperor Yi Lv was also a ghost king. But he was different from Emperor Li. He had been a ghost for a long time, and had been muddle-headed for a long time. As a result, his mind was damaged. He couldn't remember many things clearly. He was like an especially forgetful old man. But now that he saw Li Yunqin again and heard his words, he finally remembered this person. It was this person who broke the seal of his ruined palace and allowed him to regain his mind. He had the fortune he had today. When he remembered this, he immediately burst into laughter, startling the huge beasts under the rock and causing them to growl in a low voice. "When I first saw you, you were still a human, and now, you have also become a demon. Ha ha ha, we can be considered to be kindred spirits." Hearing this, Ding Min and Su Mao's expressions changed. Demon? Cunning and cruel demon? Kong Tongzi's expression also changed. But it wasn't because of the demon. It was because he finally remembered the name Li Yunqin. Wasn't he the demon that Daotong and Kenzo captured? He had been humiliated by a demon for such a long time. Now, he was crawling at the demon's feet. Where was the justice of the world? He became more desperate and angry. He suddenly raised his head and shouted at Li Yunqin, "It's you!" He enunciated each word clearly before he gritted his teeth. "You audacious demon! You went against sword sect's orthodoxy, and a few days ago, you were chased by my sect leader like a stray dog. You managed to escape with your life, and now you're hiding in the mountains and don't dare show your face. Hee. Ha 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 ha. Ridiculous, pathetic, and lamentable." Kong Tongzi's voice was getting more and more excited, and there was even a hint of sadness in his laughter. "You are a coward, and now you only dare to go with people with low cultivation like me. Now I feel relieved. I am only at the level of transcendent state, but I have been fighting with you, a monster of true state, for a whole day. Now, I have fallen into the hands of you three demons. Even if I die, it will be a glorious death." Previously, he wanted to fight with the two ghost emperors. But now that he thought of this Li Yunqin, he knew he was famous for being cruel and cunning. So he knew he couldn't live. Since he had the will to die, he could express it to his heart's content. As he shouted, he felt his blood was boiling. He was not afraid of any demons anymore. After he finished, he glared at Li Yunqin. Although he was still sitting on the ground, his back was ramrod straight, like a nail stuck in a rock. When the Li Guoqing kingdom soldiers heard this, they slowly understood. The so-called Taoist priest, Primordial Chaos, was a great demon. Furthermore, He was being captured by the sword sect orthodoxy. Hiding in the crowd. Was it to deceive people? Ding Min and Su Mao looked at each other. They didn't know what to say. So Li Yunqin sighed. It is better to be a demon, but it is also troublesome. He shook his head at Yi Emperor Lv Zhunyang. After we parted, I heard news about you. In order to protect my people, you fought with the Taoists of Langye Cave Heaven. At that time, I was worried that you would die. I felt regretful for a while. Until now. He cupped his hands at Emperor Li. Of course, I have heard of the Emperor of Li Kingdom. His cultivation is close to that of Grand Shang. Now that the two ghost emperors are here, what do you want to do? You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.